The book lay open at Book 4, upon the warm pale stone bench, beneath the tall yew of the inner walk of the Winterbourne Rose Garden at 20 minutes past 8 on the cold blue Wiltshire morning of Tuesday, the 27th of August, 1816, and the small leather binding of the Tacitus had been turned outward so that the gilt lettering on the spine, Annales, caught the cold morning sun. The bench was old. The pale Wiltshire limestone had been warmed by the long, slow August of the days preceding, so that the heat of the previous afternoon was held in the stone still, gathered under the deep green shade of the yew that arched the inner walk and made of it a small chamber roofed in dark needles. The book lay precisely at the centre of the bench, the pages held quietly open by the soft morning air. The close, even type of an old Cambridge edition, rising to the eye like a row of small composed soldiers. Upon the open book, a single sheet of fine cream-laid paper had been laid. Upon the cream paper, in the careful pencil of an even, well-formed, unmistakably feminine hand, the half-drawn opening of a Bourbon rose was beginning to take shape, the outermost petals already softly sectioned, the inner petals indicated only by their first quiet shadow, the dimensions noted in a small neat hand at the lower left of the sheet. In the upper margin, in the same clear pencil, stood the Latin tag Rosa centifolia. In the right margin, beside the open book, ran a quiet pencil translation of the Tacitus passage in plain English, as accurate as a tutor's and a great deal more witty. Beside the book, a small black silk reticule sat upright, its narrow-drawn cords laid neatly along its side. Beside the reticule, with an exactness that spoke of habit, lay a pair of pale cream kid garden gloves, except that there was only one. The right glove had been laid alone on the warm stone, the cream leather smoothed flat with a thumb. The pencil rested in the gutter of the book. The morning bees were among the open white roses on the south wall. The cold blue Wiltshire August sun had come over the box hedge 5 minutes since and was crossing the gravel inch by patient inch. In the elms beyond the wall, a wood pigeon spoke twice and was answered. The garden held, in the quiet of an English country morning, the small composed silence of an arrangement made by a hand that had stepped out of it for 1 minute only, and would, in that minute, return. There are stories that begin with a kiss. There are stories that begin with a vow. There are stories that begin with what is not there. There are stories that begin with a knock, and stories that begin with a hired post-chaise. And there are, rarer, harder, more dignified, stories that begin with an open book of Tacitus's Annales upon a warm Wiltshire stone bench at 20 minutes past 8 on a cold blue August morning, when a 31-year-old duke, who had come down from London the night before to inspect 3 eldest daughters of an old Cambridge friend, was about to step round the box hedge of an inner walk of the rose garden and find, instead of the Bourbon roses he had been promised, a 4th daughter. Her name was Lady Persephone Eleanor Winterbourne, and she was 23. She was the 4th daughter of Lord Caspar Winterbourne, 5th Earl of Winterbourne. 56, silver-grey thinning hair, pale blue watery eyes, a little ruined by indoor port, fair skin gone florid at the nose, narrow weak chin, slumping medium frame of 5'10", kindly meant and settled in his prejudices, and of the late Lady Rowena Winterbourne, who had died in 1809 of childbed of a 5th and stillborn son, and whose ivory cameo on a thin black silk cord her 4th daughter wore at her throat each morning since. There had been a fall, in October 1808, from her own quiet hunter on the high stone wall of the home park. She had been 9 weeks in bed. She had recovered as fully as could be wished, save for a small composed slowness in her right step that no London ballroom had ever consented to permit. She had been 15 at the fall, 16 at her father's first quiet decision that she should not, that season, go up to town and 23 this last spring at his most recent reaffirmation of the same. She had not been to London in 7 years. She kept the home farm accounts at her father's quiet permission. She had taught herself the 3 later books of Tacitus, with no tutor and no encouragement, against the small, steady devotion of her old governess, Miss Prudence Fairbairn, 60 this, Michaelmas, silver-white hair beneath a small white lace cap, warm, pale blue eyes finely lined, kind round face, plain black bombazine, white linen apron, small jet cross, kept on at Winterbourne since 1808 as her companion, and the only adult in the house who had asked Lady Persephone any question of any consequence in 7 years. She had long, rich, chestnut-brown, wavy hair, pinned smooth in a low chignon with small wisps escaped at the temples, clear sea-grey blue eyes, the colour of Wiltshire chalk stream water in late summer, with thick, dark lashes and a very steady, direct gaze, ivory fair English skin with a faint, warm rose flush across the cheekbones, a small natural beauty mark just above the left corner of her upper lip, a faint scattering of freckles across the bridge of her nose. Her face was oval, her features delicate and fine. She stood 5'5", upright, her voice a soft, warm, low contralto. She wore that morning her plain, high-waisted, soft, pale rose-pink muslin morning gown, with short puff sleeves and a white lawn fichu at the throat, the small ivory cameo on its black silk cord at her neck, plain ivory silk slippers on the gravel, and a single white bourbon rose newly cut in her ungloved right hand. The left glove was on her left hand, the right she had laid upon the bench when she had bent to the rose bush. The man about to come round the box hedge was Lucian Henry Ashburn, 6th Duke of Aldwych, 31. He had come into the dukedom in October of the year before, upon his father's death. He had spent the 8 months since at Aldwych Park, Sussex, in his proper mourning, and he had come down by post-chaise from London the night before upon the august invitation of his old Cambridge friend, Mortimer Winterbourne, 28, Viscount Winterbourne, chestnut-brown hair like his sister, sea-grey blue eyes like his sister, fair tanned from riding, open kind face, tall 6 foot lean, dark green country coat, buff waistcoat, brown-topped boots, with the unspoken understanding, common to both fathers designing, that the visit should include the consideration of an offer to one of the 3 elder Winterbourne daughters, all of whom were that week in town and not expected at Wiltshire until Friday. He had arrived on the Monday evening at 6:45, had dined with Mortimer at 7:30 in the small green dining room, the Earl absent at his Wiltshire farms, the 4 daughters absent likewise, the 3 elder in town with their aunt Lady Guinevere Stafford, the 4th of whom Mortimer had spoken only once and briefly, not coming down to dinner, and had retired at 10. This morning he had risen at 7, dressed without his man, and gone down quietly by the side stair into the rose garden alone. Breakfast was at 9. He had half an hour to himself. He had thick, dark, bronze-brown, wavy hair, cut close at the nape, and just brushing his coat collar, with the faintest silver only at the right temple and one lock fallen across his brow. Clear, deep, emerald-green eyes, true, cool emerald, with flecks of dark gold that firelight drew out, with thick, dark lashes and a steady, considering gaze, fair, faintly weathered skin from country riding, a faint shadow at the jaw, no visible scars. His face was strong and angular, the cheekbones high, the nose straight Roman, the mouth firm and grave, the jaw clean-edged with a small dark mole at the right corner of the lower lip. He stood 6'1", lean and broad-shouldered, the build of a Cambridge oarsman. His voice was a deep, clear, quiet baritone, capable of fluent Latin. He wore that morning a dark blue superfine morning coat, a buff waistcoat with small silver buttons, buff breeches, brown-topped boots, and a white cravat. The Aldwych ducal signet ring, heavy silver with the crest of a sea falcon over a chalk pail, sat upon his right hand. A plain dark brown beaver hat hung loose in that hand. He turned the corner of the box hedge into the inner walk of the rose garden. He saw the bench beneath the tall yew, the book set out upon it, the gilt of Annalise catching the cold blue sun. He saw the loose sheet of cream-laid paper upon the open page, the half-drawn rose, the single garden glove, and the small black reticule, by every small particular, the trace of an absent person who had stepped away for 1 minute only. He stopped. For a breath, he did not move at all. Then, with the particular carefulness of a man who has been raised to handle his late mother's books, he set his hat down on the gravel beside the bench, and he picked up the little Tacitus, fingers under the loose sheet so that nothing should stir, and he held it open in his palm and read the pencil translation in the margin. It was precisely accurate. It was not a tutor's hand. The hand was too small and too composed, and the translator had rendered Tacitus's irony in plain English with a small, dry English wit that no tutor he had ever known would have permitted to stand in a margin. He read the passage twice. He read it a third time. He set the book down upon the bench again, exactly as he had found it, the loose sheet undisturbed. He picked up his hat. He turned. She was at the box hedge gap 6 feet behind him. She had come up so quietly upon the gravel that he had not heard her step. She stood there a moment without speaking, the white bourbon rose still in her ungloved right hand, her clear sea-grey blue eyes very steady upon him, the small composed slowness in her right step held for the moment in stillness. She inclined her head 1/4 of an inch. She said in clear, unhurried Latin, in a soft, warm, low contralto that took the morning by surprise. Salve, tu es magister tacitorum quem expectabamus. It was an honest inquiry. There had been talk in the household only the week before of a Tacitus tutor sent down for the elder boys of a neighbouring family, a clergyman of Sarum who had been promised but not yet arrived. She had supposed this gentleman in the dark coat at the bench, whom she did not know, must be he, Lucian Ashburn, who had not been mistaken for a tutor in 11 years, who had not laughed in the 8 months since his father's funeral, laughed once. The sound was short, low, and surprised, and it astonished him in his own throat. He composed his face. He inclined his head, the proper inclination of a duke to a young woman who has spoken to him in Latin in her own father's rose garden, and he replied in his own quiet Latin, Domina, vereo ne tui falsus sim, ducem sum aldviciensem qui hodie mane advenit. She did not blush. She did not apologize. The clear sea-grey blue eyes, which had been steady, became, for the smallest instant, composed in a different way, and then steady again. She inclined her head a 2/4 inch. She said in clear, unhurried English, Forgive me, Your Grace. I had not been told a duke was expected. My father had spoken only of an old Cambridge friend of my brother's. I shall not this morning ask you to translate the rest of Tacitus's Book 4. She walked past him, then, the gravel quiet under her ivory silk slippers, to the bench. She bent, the faintest fractional measuring of the right step as she did so, and she gathered up, in a single composed economy of motion, the book, the loose sheet of cream paper, the small black silk reticule, and the right glove. She straightened. She turned. She walked back along the gravel toward the side door of the house, the white rose still in her hand. Her right step was a fractional 1/4 second slower than her left. She walked with a small, composed asymmetry of carriage that he had not seen in any London room. He saw it. She knew that he had seen it. She did not look at him. She passed beneath the box hedge gap and was gone. Lucian Ashburn stood for a long moment in the inner walk of the rose garden. The bees moved among the white roses on the south wall. The cold blue Wiltshire sun continued its quiet, patient travel across the gravel. He looked, in a way he had not looked at anything in 8 months, at the empty bench under the yew. Then he turned, and he went up to the house for breakfast. Breakfast was at 9 in the small breakfast parlour, with its pale yellow walls and tall sash window, upon the south lawn. The Earl had come up from his farms and sat at the head of the table. Silver-grey thinning hair, pale blue watery eyes, the kindly florid face, gracious to his guest, courteous to his son. Mortimer was cheerful. The coffee was hot. Lady Persephone, coming in 3 minutes after the half-hour, took the place at her brother's left in her plain pale rose-pink muslin gown and the ivory cameo. She wished her father good morning in her soft, warm, low contralto. She wished his Grace of Aldwych good morning. She accepted toast. She spoke once at table. Mortimer at coffee asked her, with the warm, cheerful innocence of an elder brother who had no sense at all that he was crossing an invisible line, what passage of Tacitus she had been reading in the garden that morning. She replied, civilly, in 3 composed sentences in English, that it had been Book 4, that she had been giving particular attention to the Tiberian narrative of the Senate's reception of Sejanus, the irony of which Tacitus had achieved, in her own private view, by a single placement of the verb at the end of a clause, and that she had been attempting to render that placement, in plain English, without the loss of its dryness. The Earl looked, briefly, faintly pained that she had spoken upon the subject at all. Mortimer beamed. Lucian Ashburn, sitting opposite, set down his cup very gently and said nothing. After breakfast, the Earl returned to his farms. Persephone returned to the music-room with Miss Fairbairn. Lucian rode out over the home park at 10:30 with Mortimer for the long morning's ride. They rode the south boundary first, then up over the chalk to the high field, where the stone wall ran along the crest. Mortimer, who was, in the easy way of an old college friend, a man without pretence, mentioned without being asked the matter of his sister's accident of October 1808, the quiet hunter, the wall, the 9 weeks in bed, the recovery as full as could be wished, the small stiffness in the right side, his father's settled view, since her 16th birthday, that she should be kept at Wiltshire and not put forward in town. He spoke without bitterness. He said only that he had, since coming of age, told his father once a year that he disagreed, and had each year been overruled. Lucian listened in steady silence. They rode on for a quarter of an hour without speaking. Then, as they came down off the high field toward the home wood, Lucian said only, the first observation he had offered upon the morning's events, in his deep, clear, quiet baritone, "Mortimer, your sister translates Tacitus better than the man who taught us at Cambridge." Mortimer looked at him. Mortimer, who had not been told a duke was a fool, did not say anything at all. They rode on. That evening, after dinner, at which Persephone had again worn the pale rose-pink muslin and the ivory cameo, and at which she had spoken civilly thrice, and not upon Tacitus, when the ladies had withdrawn to the drawing-room, and Mortimer had gone out to see to a matter at the stables, the Earl took his guest aside at the chimney-piece in the library. The candles burned low in their plain silver sticks. The Wiltshire August night was warm beyond the leaded window. The Earl set down his glass of port. He spoke with the apologetic candour of a fond father who believed himself to have the right to speak frankly to a duke who was also his son's old college friend. "Aldwych, I must, before the matter goes further, be plain with you. My 3 eldest girls are in town this week, and shall be down on Friday. They are accomplished, well-mannered, and, I shall make no modest disclaimer, beautiful. Cecilia, the eldest, is the one who would best honour the Aldwych title, and I shall not pretend otherwise. There is, however, a 4th daughter at Winterbourne, whom you have already met this morning in the rose garden. Marry any daughter but her. Persephone is, alas, not quite suited to the obligations of a London duchess. There was a fall, in 1808, from which she has recovered as fully as could be wished, but her right side carries a small stiffness, which the lively figures of a London assembly would, I fear, expose. I should not wish you to be put to the awkwardness of refusing what I had not, in good conscience, the right to offer. You have my permission to address any of the 3 elder. Persephone is at her own disposal at Winterbourne. We shall speak no further of her." Lucian Ashburn listened in steady silence to all 11 sentences. He did not interrupt. He did not move. When the Earl had finished, he set down his own glass of port upon the chimney-piece. He said, in his deep, clear, quiet baritone, the only sentence he intended to say upon the matter that evening. "My lord, has she ever been asked her own view on the matter?" The Earl was taken aback. The pale blue, watery eyes blinked once. The florid face was, for a moment, ungoverned. He said, with the faint stammer of a man who has, for the first time in his life, been asked a question to which he does not have a prepared answer. "View? Aldwych? That is, no, not formally. A father knows his daughter's mind." Lucian inclined his head. The proper inclination of a duke to the father of a young woman he had encountered at 20 minutes past 8 in a rose garden over an open Tacitus. He said in the same steady tone, no louder, no harder, "My lord, I shall not, in your house, discuss the matter further, but I shall require, before the fortnight is out, a private interview of half an hour with Lady Persephone, in the presence of any chaperone of her own choosing, on a question I shall ask her at her own pace. I should be obliged to you." The Earl stood at his own chimney-piece with his glass of port in his hand and said nothing for a long minute. The candles guttered. A coal settled in the grate. At last, with the particular slowness of a man who has discovered that the conversation has, in some manner he cannot quite trace, slipped from his control, he gave his agreement. Lucian returned to the drawing-room in time to bow good-night to the company and to take his candle. He climbed the wide oak stair to his guest-chamber. He set the candle on the chest by the leaded window, dismissed the man who had come in to lay out the nightshirt, and at 11:30 stood alone before the open window and looked out upon the warm Wiltshire August night. The candle was low at his elbow, the dark park stretched below in the soft midsummer quiet. A single owl spoke once across the home-wood and was answered. He thought of the bench under the yew, of the book, of the half-drawn Bourbon rose, and the Latin tag in the margin, and the pencil translation in the same clear, even hand. He thought of the soft, warm, low contralto that had said, "Salve. Tu es magister tacitorum quem expectabamus." He thought of the clear, sea-grey blue eyes, very steady, that had not looked at him as she had walked back along the gravel with the white rose in her hand. He thought of his father, who had been dead these 8 months, and of his own laugh in the rose garden, which had been the first in those 8 months. He thought of the 11 sentences his host had spoken at the chimney-piece, and of the one he had spoken in reply, and of the question to which the Earl had no prepared answer. He laid his hand quietly upon the warm, leaded glass. He said, very quietly, his first private sentence in this house, at 31. "Tomorrow." Then he blew out the candle. The small library on the south side of Winterbourne Hall took the warm Wiltshire morning sun, very kindly at 10:30 on Wednesday the 28th of August, 1816. Pale Georgian plaster ceiling, dark walnut bookcases along 3 walls, tall sash window open by an inch upon the south lawn, admitting bees in the lavender below. 2 faded ivory silk wing-back chairs stood by the marble chimney-piece, unlit, for it was high summer, and the long, polished walnut writing table in the centre had been laid with a Tacitus, a sheet of cream paper, a pencil, and Persephone's enamelled writing case. She had come down at 10:20 in in her plain, high-waisted, dove-grey wool morning gown with long sleeves and high round neck, white lawn fichu at the throat, the small ivory cameo on its thin black silk cord at her neck. Her long, rich chestnut-brown hair had been pinned in its smooth, low chignon, with small wisps escaped at the temples. Her clear, sea-grey blue eyes were very steady. She had walked down the long gallery at her own pace, the small, composed slowness in her right step held quietly within the rhythm of her step, and had taken the chair to the right of the writing table, so the sun fell upon her left side and not in her face. Mortimer Winterbourne was already in the deep window seat at her quiet request, his Tacitus open upon his knee. He wore his dark green country coat, buff waistcoat, brown-topped boots. His open, kind face, beneath the chestnut-brown hair, was turned half toward the lawn and half toward his sister. He had smiled at her once, as she had taken her seat. Miss Prudence Fairbairn sat upright by the door with her sewing, plain white linen for the parish charity, silver white hair under the small white lace cap, warm, pale blue eyes finely lined, plain black bombazine, white linen apron, small jet cross at her throat. Lucian Ashburn came in at 10:30 exactly. He wore his dark walnut-brown country coat, buff waistcoat, buff breeches, brown-topped boots. The heavy silver Aldwych ducal signet ring, with its sea falcon over a chalk pail, sat upon his right hand. The thick, dark bronze-brown wavy hair, with the faint silver at the right temple and the one lock fallen across his brow, had been brushed back. The clear, deep emerald green eyes were steady. He bowed at the door, to Persephone first, to Mortimer, to Miss Fairbairn. Persephone inclined her head 1/4 inch. Mortimer nodded. Miss Fairbairn, without looking up, said quietly, "Your Grace." Lucian crossed the polished oak floor and took the second chair, with the morning sun behind his right shoulder, so that the light fell across her hands and not her eyes. He set his hands quietly upon the polished walnut. The clock on the chimney-piece marked the half-hour with a small silver chime, and when the chime had quite died away, Lucian began. "Lady Persephone," he said in his deep, clear, quiet baritone, "I should be obliged if you would tell me what books you have been reading." She considered the question for the smallest measured moment, and then she replied, in her soft, warm, low contralto, "Your Grace, I am at present reading the Annales of Tacitus in the small Cambridge edition. I am in Book 4, of which the Bishop of Sarum has been good enough to expect from me a clean, fair-copied translation by Christmas. I am also reading the Letters of Madame de Sévigné in the new Paris edition that Mortimer was kind enough to bring me from town in March. I am reading Mr. Wordsworth's poems in 2 volumes, which I have read twice through and shall read a 3rd time before the autumn. I am reading the late Mr. Burke upon the Sublime, with which I have been acquainted in part since I was 18, and I am giving my evenings, in a small private way, to a rereading of the Aeneid in Mr. Pope's English translation, set against the Latin upon the opposite page. She said it as a young woman gives an honest accounting of her own hours, in no tone of self-display. Lucian held her gaze with the steady, quiet way of a man met at last by his understanding equal. He inclined his head. "Lady Persephone," he said, "you have, in 5 books, named more genuine reading than 3 of my own Cambridge friends had got through in 3 years." He said it as a plain observation of fact, and not as a compliment. She did not blush. She said, "Your Grace, I have had 7 years at Winterbourne. The library here has 6,000 volumes." It was answered as cleanly as a calculation in arithmetic. Mortimer smiled once into his Tacitus. Miss Fairbairn drew her needle through the linen and said nothing. Lucian inclined his head a second time. "Lady Persephone," he said then, "may I ask my second question? I should be obliged for your own view upon the proper management of a country estate." She gave him, clearly and quietly, 10 minutes of her own considered view. of drainage upon a chalk subsoil, and the patient laying of small stone-lined channels rather than great open ditches, of the rotation of the home pasture on a 4-year cycle with mangold wurzel as a winter feed for the mutton fold, of the handling of tenant leases at 3 lives, or 21 years, and the small dignities of yearly inspection by the family rather than only by the agent, of the keeping of plain ledgered accounts at quarter day, of the steady enforcement of small repairs upon the cottage roofs before the December rains. She had, she said, been keeping the Winterbourne home farm accounts for 2 years at her father's quiet permission. She had in those 2 years saved £42 upon the lower park drainage by laying the stone-lined channels in spring rather than autumn. She had increased the mutton tally by 30 head by the patient introduction of mangold, and she had quietly reformed 3 tenant leases carelessly drawn in 1807, costing the estate £15 to £20 a year apiece in unpaid quit rent. She named the £42 and the 30 head and the 3 leases as plainly as she had named her 5 books. Lucian asked 2 follow-up questions, one upon the mangold rotation in the West Country damp, one upon the drafting of a quit-rent clause to allow for poor harvest. She answered both with the same clear competence. He inclined his head a 3rd time, with the steady considering gaze of a man bringing to a person whom he had already begun to consider his proper equal. When she had finished, he allowed a small measured silence. Then he said, "Lady Persephone, may I ask my 3rd? What would you do, if you were free, with the next 10 years of your life?" The room held very still. The clock moved its second hand through 1/2 minute, and Persephone sat with her ungloved hands quietly together upon the cream paper and considered. She looked at Lucian Ashburn with her clear sea-grey blue eyes very steady, and replied, word for careful word, "Your Grace, I should like to read all the Greek dramatists in the original. I should like to keep my own correspondence with 3 or 4 scholars of competence. I should like to have a small private fund for the endowment of a girls' school upon my mother's name in Wiltshire. And I should like, perhaps, to be married, but only, Your Grace, to a man who had asked me my own view on the matter and not my father's. I do not require in any of these things the lively figures of a London ballroom." Lucian listened in steady silence. When she had finished, he said nothing for the next 1/2 minute. Mortimer had set down his book. Miss Fairbairn had stilled her needle. Lucian inclined his head, the deepest inclination he had given that morning. He said, "Lady Persephone, thank you. I shall consider what you have said for the next 23 hours. May I have the privilege of asking you a 4th question, at the same hour, in this same room, tomorrow?" She said, "Your Grace, you may." He bowed, and to Mortimer, and to Miss Fairbairn. He withdrew at the proper measured pace. The interview by Mortimer's pocket watch had lasted 43 minutes. Through the rest of that Wednesday, Lucian rode alone over the high Winterbourne Downs, the long bridle path along the chalk crest above the home valley. He returned at 4. He dined with the family at 6. The Earl gracious, the elder sisters and Lady Guinevere not yet down from London, and retired at 10. Thursday, the 29th of August, broke warm and quiet. Persephone worked at her own desk through the morning upon Book 4 for the Bishop of Sarum. At 3 in the afternoon, she came down again to the small South Library in the same dove-grey wool and white lawn fichu and ivory cameo. Mortimer in the window-seat, Miss Fairbairn at the door. Persephone took her chair. Lucian came in at 3 exactly. He bowed. He took the chair opposite. Then, without preamble, he said the thing he had ridden the high downs the day before, to find the proper plain way to say. "Lady Persephone, I shall, with your leave, tell you plainly what your father told me in the library on Tuesday evening, after dinner, when the ladies had withdrawn and your brother had stepped out to the stables. He stood at his own chimney-piece with a glass of port in his hand, and he spoke to me in the apologetic candour of a fond father. He said that his 3 eldest girls were in town and would be down on Friday, that they were accomplished and well-mannered and beautiful, and that Lady Cecilia was the daughter who would best honour the Aldwych title. He said that there was, however, a 4th daughter at Winterbourne, whom I had met that morning in the rose garden. He said, "Marry any daughter but her." He said that there had been a fall in 1808 from which you had recovered as fully as could be wished, but that your right side carried a small stiffness which the lively figures of a London assembly would, he feared, expose. He said that he should not wish me to be put to the awkwardness of refusing what he had not, in good conscience, the right to offer. He said that I had his permission to address any of the 3 elder. He said that you were at your own disposal at Winterbourne, and he said that he and I should speak no further of you. There were 11 sentences. I have repeated them to you in their substance verbatim, in my own voice, for your hearing. Persephone listened to the 11 sentences her father had spoken at his own chimney-piece on Tuesday, repeated in the steady plain baritone of a man she had known 6 days. She did not weep. She did not lower her eyes. The clear, sea-grey-blue gaze remained very steady upon Lucian's emerald-green one. Mortimer had set down his Tacitus. Miss Fairbairn had stilled her needle. When Lucian had finished, she said, "Word for careful word." "Your Grace." I had supposed as much, since I was about 17. My father has been an honourable man within the limits of his honour. I shall not, in any conversation we 2 may have hereafter, hold him accountable for that limit. I should be obliged for your own view of my father's settled view. Lucian did not pause. He gave the proper plain words. "Madame, I find that your father's settled view of his daughter has materially less interest for me than his daughter's settled view of her father. May I, with your leave, ask you a 4th question upon a different morning?" Persephone inclined her head 1/4 inch. She said, "Tomorrow, your Grace, if you will." He bowed, and to Mortimer, and to Miss Fairbairn. He withdrew. The second interview, by Mortimer's pocket watch, had lasted 28 minutes. Mortimer crossed the room without speaking, and laid his hand for a quiet moment upon his sister's shoulder, then went out to the stables. That evening at the small family dinner, the Earl was gracious. The Wiltshire weather had been kind to his harvest. He spoke of it at length. Persephone spoke once at table, and only on the matter of the weather, that the long, dry August had been a particular benefit to the home meadow. She did not, in Lucian's hearing, lift her sea-grey-blue eyes once to her father's face. The Earl, no fool in such small private matters, observed the same thing for himself by the second remove. He looked beside the candles, faintly older than he had on Tuesday evening. Friday the 30th of August came in clear and warm. The household had been told that the elder sisters and Lady Guinevere Stafford were expected by tea-time. The Earl had ordered the south chambers aired. Miss Fairbairn had had Persephone's blush-pink silk evening gown brought out from its tissue paper. The atmosphere of the small south library at 10 in the morning, however, was as still as on the Wednesday and Thursday before. Persephone in the dove-grey wool, Mortimer in the window-seat, Miss Fairbairn at the door, the clock chiming the hour. Lucian came in at 10 exactly. He bowed. He took the chair opposite. The clear, deep, emerald-green eyes did not, this morning, drift to the south window or the bookshelves. They remained upon her own. He had come to the question with the proper plain words ready. "Lady Persephone," he said, "word for careful word. If you were free of your father's settled view, would you, in your own private composure, accept the addresses of a man who had asked you in this room 3 quiet questions upon books, upon the home farm, and upon the next 10 years of your life, and who proposed to ask you this morning a fourth question upon his own continued attendance upon you?" Persephone held the steady, clear, sea-grey blue gaze upon his. She allowed a quiet half-minute. The clock measured it. Then she replied, word for careful word. "Your Grace, I should accept the addresses, with the composure of a young woman who has not, in 7 years, been asked any question at all, and who will not pretend that being asked for is a small thing." Lucian inclined his head the deepest inclination she had yet seen him give. He spoke the next sentence as plainly as a man speaks the words of a vow. "Then I shall, madam, attend you at Winterbourne and at London and wherever else you shall permit, until such hour as you shall, at your own time, give me leave to ask you the larger one. I do not require your hand this morning. I require only your leave to attend you." She gave it. She said only, "Your Grace, you have it." He bowed. He did not cross the writing table. He did not reach for her hand. He did not so much as set his fingers upon the polished walnut between them. He bowed to her, to Mortimer, to Miss Fairbairn. He withdrew. The third interview, by Mortimer's pocket watch, had lasted 19 minutes. Mortimer set down his Tacitus and looked at his sister across the polished walnut and said nothing. Miss Fairbairn drew her needle through the linen and said only at length, "My dear." Persephone rose at her own pace, the small composed slowness in her right step held quietly within the rhythm of her step, and crossed to the south window and looked out upon the lavender and the pale blue August sky over the home park, and did not speak. The post-chaise carrying Lady Guinevere Stafford and the 3 elder daughters rolled into the gravel sweep at 3 that afternoon. Lady Guinevere descended in her lavender silk, 48, glossy chestnut-brown hair under a fashionable lace cap, large pale grey eyes settled in their snobberies, alabaster lightly powdered, 5'7" slim. Cecilia descended after her in travelling pelisse over the gold-blonde Greek coronet, pale blue eyes, alabaster, slim, 5'7". Daphne after, 22, gold-blonde, hazel-eyed, Eudora last, 20, gold-blonde and grey-eyed and quiet. The 4 ladies were settled in their chambers. Persephone, who had received her sisters at the door with civil composure, kissed Cecilia, was kissed by Daphne, was nodded to by Lady Guinevere, and quietly excused herself at 4:30 to her own chamber. Saturday the 31st of August brought a small Wiltshire country dinner, 14 at table, the Earl at the head, Mortimer at the foot, Lucian to the Earl's right, Lady Guinevere to his left, the Vicar of Winterbourne, the Stafford family solicitor, Sir Justin Harvey of Salisbury, 28, brown-haired, kind, a country baronet in dark blue evening tailcoat, invited by the Earl as a courtesy, and known to the elder sisters as Cecilia's quiet Wiltshire correspondent, 3 other neighbours and the 4 daughters. Persephone wore her soft blush-pink silk evening gown, a London-fitted piece sent down 10 months earlier and never worn at Winterbourne, brought out of its tissue paper that afternoon by Miss Fairbairn, with short puff sleeves and a narrow row of small antique seed pearls embroidered at the hem, her late mother's small pearl and coral drop earrings at her ears, the ivory cameo on its black silk cord at her throat. After dinner in the drawing-room, when the gentlemen had come through from their port, Lady Guinevere Stafford took her chair beside Persephone at the long sofa in her deep rose silk for company, and addressed her with the polite cut of a London chaperone whose 3 seasons had taught her the placing of a needle to a fraction of an inch. "Lady Persephone, how charming to find you at home. I had quite assumed you would have spent the season in town with your sisters, but Cecilia tells me your Wiltshire airs suit you better." Persephone did not lower her clear, sea-grey blue eyes. She did not glance toward Lucian at the chimney-piece with Sir Justin Harvey. She did not glance at her father. She replied, Word for careful word. Aunt, the Wiltshire airs do indeed suit me. I am at present occupied with a translation of Tacitus's Annales, which the Bishop of Sarum has been good enough to expect from me by Christmas. I do not believe I should have got through Book 4 in town. The polite cut, having met its plain steady answer, was silenced. The large, pale grey eyes blinked once. Lady Guinevere, after the smallest measured moment, took up her teacup. She did not address Persephone again that evening. Cecilia Winterbourne, the eldest, in soft Wiltshire blue silk, the gold-blonde Greek coronet very becoming under the candles, had observed in the 6 days since her arrival the steady direction of the Duke's quiet attention. She came across the saloon at 10:30, when Eudora was settling herself at the pianoforte, and sat beside Persephone in the window corner with the composure of an elder sister who had no intention of standing in the way of what she now perfectly understood. She lowered her voice to the small private key 2 sisters use in a saloon. Persephone, I should be obliged for the Bourbon Rose sketch you began on Tuesday. Sir Justin has expressed an interest. I shall, I think, give it him as a private memento before he returns to Salisbury. Persephone considered her sister a moment. The clear sea-grey blue eyes held the pale blue ones. Then, very quietly, she lifted the small black silk reticule from the cushion at her side, drew from it the half-drawn Bourbon Rose sketch she had carried since Tuesday morning, and placed it in her elder sister's hand. Cecilia closed her fingers upon it, leaned forward and kissed Persephone upon the cheek, a single steady sisterly kiss, and rose and went to the pianoforte. The small country evening went on its civil way. The vicar spoke of a rural dean's meeting. Sir Justin Harvey spoke quietly to Cecilia at the pianoforte. Lucian stood at the chimney-piece with the Aldwych signet ring upon his right hand, the clear, deep, emerald-green eyes resting now and again, in the steady, considering way she had first seen at the bench, beneath the yew, upon the young woman in soft, blush-pink silk in the window corner who had answered an aunt's polite cut without raising her voice. The candles burned low, the clock chimed 11, then the half-hour. Persephone took her own candle at 5 minutes before midnight, bid her father a civil good night, was kissed by Mortimer upon the temple, was nodded to by Lucian from across the room at the proper distance, and went up the wide oak stair to her own chamber alone. Miss Fairbairn had laid the cream cashmere shawl across the writing-chair and turned down the bed. She drew the curtains, wished her young charge a quiet good night, and withdrew. Persephone stood for a moment in the soft, blush-pink silk evening gown before the leaded window of her own chamber, with the ivory cameo at her throat and her mother's pearl and coral drop earrings at her ears, and looked out upon the dark home park under the late summer Wiltshire stars. Then she crossed to the small mahogany writing desk by the window, took up her small leather-bound private journal in its plain calf binding, unstoppered the inkwell, dipped her pen. In her clear, even hand, she wrote one new line. Winterbourne, the 31st of August, 1816. He has asked me 4 questions in 3 days. He has asked my father none. I shall, with my own composure, give him the answer to the larger one, at his own time, in his own room, upon his own day. P. She blotted it carefully, closed the journal, set the pen back in its tray, blew out the candle, and slept. Sunday, the 1st of September, dawned warm and slow over the Wiltshire Downs, the home park lying under a pale gold haze. The bells of St. Michael's at Winterbourne village had begun their first peal at 9:15, and by the Sabbath hour the household had walked down through the lime avenue to the low Norman church for matins. Persephone took her seat in the family pew between Mortimer and Miss Fairbairn, the ivory cameo at the high round neck of her dove-grey wool gown and her gloved hands folded upon the open prayer book. Lucian sat one bench behind, where the pew architecture properly placed a guest, and watched in the slanting Sabbath light the composed line of her shoulder under the old grey wool, the smooth low chignon at her nape, the single fine brow that was not lowered. She made the responses in her clear, soft contralto, with the steady accuracy of a young woman who had read the Book of Common Prayer in her own room on Saturday evening. After the recessional, Mortimer proposed a ride. They mounted at 11:15 and went out through the home park at the long swinging walk and trot of two old Cambridge men. They spoke of the September corn prices and Mortimer's shorthorn herd, then, without any change of voice, of his sister. "She has been keeping our home farm books these 2 years," Mortimer said. "Father gave her the leave because he could not, in honour, refuse her any small occupation. She has saved him £140 in this last 12-month. She does not speak of it. I notice it because I am the heir." Lucian listened. He said only, "Mortimer, will you be at her elbow on Wednesday morning in the small library at 8? Mortimer turned his bay head. "I shall be in the deep window seat. She asked me on Friday evening at 10:30. I had not, before that hour, supposed she meant to give you any answer at all." In the afternoon, Persephone took her cream straw bonnet and walked with Lucian in the rose garden. Miss Fairbairn followed 3 paces behind on the gravel, the strict Wiltshire chaperone distance, neither closer nor further, her sewing basket on her arm. Persephone paused beneath the great white climber over the iron arch, lifted her face to the slow, warm scent, and let a small September bee pass an inch from her cheek without flinching. Lucian, half a pace at her left side, said, "I had thought, when I came round the box hedge on Tuesday, that the rose garden was empty." "It was," she said. "I had gone in for 10 minutes to look at the small beetle on the south climber. I had laid the Tacitus and the gloves on the bench while I looked, and then I heard your step on the gravel." "I did not hear yours," he said. "I walk a little quietly upon a gravel walk. It is one of the small economies of 7 Wiltshire years." He inclined his head. They walked the inner walk twice in silence, and at the second turn beneath the tall yew, Persephone said in her own quiet voice, "Wednesday, Your Grace, at 8. He said, "Wednesday, Madame, at 8. That was the whole of their afternoon's exchange. Monday the 2nd of September brought no peace. At 3 in the afternoon, the post-chaise from Winchester turned in at the lodge gates and rolled at a self-important pace up the Lime Avenue, and the Aldwych guest at the long library window watched Lord Barnaby Winterbourne descend in his dark brown wool tailcoat with the worn gilt buttons, his primrose yellow waistcoat slightly stained at the lower flap, his buff pantaloons creased from the chaise, his top boots wanting polish. The thinning sandy grey hair had been carefully oiled forward over the high forehead. The small, shallow, watery blue eyes blinked once at the September light. The sallow cheeks with their broken claret veins composed themselves into the half-smile of practised self-importance, and Lord Barnaby gave his hat to the footman with the air of a man arrived to set a family inconvenience to rights. The Earl received him in the small library at 3:15. They spoke for the better part of an hour. Lord Barnaby pressed, in his oiled circular way, the matter that had kept him for 7 years upon his elder brother's quiet allowance, that the £10,000 settled by the late Lady Rowena upon Persephone in 1809 would, in the event of his niece marrying before her 30th birthday, vest entirely in Persephone and her husband's settlements, and that, in the event of her remaining unmarried at 30, a contingency he had, for 7 years, found very pleasant to contemplate, the same £10,000 would fall to the next of male kin, which was to say, to himself. He had no formal claim. He had only a brotherly concern that the family should not be hasty. Lord Caspar listened, He had not, in 7 years, given his brother the smallest cause to imagine he stood in any trusty relation to his niece's settlement. He did not give him cause this afternoon either. At 4 o'clock, the door of the small library opened, and Lord Barnaby withdrew into the long passage in some private temper, having received from the head of his family a courteous and quite unyielding refusal. At dinner that evening, Lord Barnaby, seated by the Earl's instruction at some distance from his niece, attempted nevertheless across the asparagus to engage Lady Persephone in a small private speech. He asked, with elaborate uncle solicitude, whether the Wiltshire airs had quite restored the small composure she had been at trouble to maintain since her fall. Persephone laid down her fork. She raised her clear, sea-grey blue eyes to her uncle's small, shallow, watery blue ones. She said, with the gracious evasiveness her 7 Wiltshire years had taught her to perfection, "I am, uncle, in entirely usual composure. I am much obliged for the inquiry. The vicar was, before you spoke, telling Mortimer of the new sexton at Winterbourne village. I should be sorry to interrupt the matter further." Lord Barnaby, having struck the small, even surface of his niece's quiet steadiness, as a passing carriage-wheel strikes a fence-post, recoiled a fraction, without quite knowing he had done so. The vicar resumed. Persephone took up her fork. Lucian, opposite, observed the small, precise victory, and made no acknowledgment of it whatever. After the ladies had withdrawn and the port had come round, Lord Barnaby, emboldened by a 3rd and a 4th glass, addressed Lucian across the long mahogany with the practised insinuation he had, at small Hampshire and Wiltshire dinners these 20 years, found generally answer. "Aldwych, between gentlemen, one cannot quite ignore the small Winterbourne stiffness, eh? I should not, in your boots, wish to put it to the obligations of a London duchess. Town will see what it sees." Mortimer set down his glass. Sir Justin Harvey, at Lucian's right, did not move. Lucian set down his own glass. He laid his right hand, upon which the heavy silver Aldwych signet caught the candle, flat upon the dark mahogany. He looked across the table at Lord Barnaby, with the steady considering emerald-green gaze that had, on Tuesday morning at the Box Hedge, taken its first proper measure of a young woman of 23. He said, in his deep, clear, quiet baritone, "Lord Barnaby, your niece has shown me, in 3 private conversations of her own consenting, more competence in the management of a country estate, more accuracy in the translation of classical Latin, and more steady composure under your brother's settled view than I had supposed any woman of any age could display. The matter of her marriage, when and to whom it occurs, is between her, her father, and the man she chooses. I shall not discuss it further at this table. Will you take a glass of port?" The decanter was passed. Lord Barnaby, his sallow cheeks gone a shade more sallow under their broken veins, accepted half a glass. He said nothing further that evening. He left Winterbourne at 9 the following morning, Tuesday the 3rd of September, in his hired chaise, in a private temper that the chalk roads did nothing to ease. Sir Justin Harvey took leave of the Earl at the same hour, having had, before breakfast, a final quiet conversation with Cecilia in the morning-room upon a matter that would be properly announced in the last week of September. He drove out in his own gig, in his own private peace. Wednesday the 4th of September dawned cool and clear, the slanting September sun coming low through the tall sash windows of the east front and the home park lying in the soft, pale gold of an early autumn morning. The household had been informed.
I must
that His
apologize for
Grace
my
would
candor
take leave
earlier.
at
It was
noon.
not my intent to cause you
Persephone
unease.
had risen at
Your words were
6:30,
clear and necessary.
had
I
taken her
hold no
usual
unease.
cold walk
I'm
to the
relieved
chalk
to hear
stream
it.
with Mortimer at 7, and was at the small library door in her plain dove-grey wool gown with the white lawn fichu and the ivory cameo a quarter before 8. Mortimer was already in the deep window seat. Miss Fairbairn was at the door with her sewing basket settled on her lap. Lucian, in his dark walnut-brown country coat, The buff waistcoat, the buff breeches and the brown-topped boots was at the writing table. The clock upon the chimney-piece struck the first gentle note of 8. Lucian rose. He inclined his head to Miss Fairbairn at the door, to Mortimer in the window seat, to Persephone, who had taken the small upright chair beside the writing table and laid her ungloved hands quietly upon her knee. He said, in his deep, clear, quiet baritone, "Lady Persephone, Eleanor Winterbourne, I have, in the 8 days I have been a guest in your father's house, asked you 4 questions of my own and observed the steady composure with which you have answered them. I should now like to ask you the 5th. Will you do me the honour of becoming my wife, freely on your own account, with no reference to your father's settled view, with the marriage to take place at St. Anselm's, Aldwych, at whatever date you and your brother and Miss Fairbairn shall together consider proper, with the consent that you shall remain at Winterbourne for as long this autumn as you wish to remain, and with the understanding that whatever you have asked of the next 10 years of your life shall be, in our marriage, your own to pursue." She did not answer at once. The clock upon the chimney-piece, having struck the hour, ticked on into the small, even silence of a Wiltshire library at 8 o'clock in the morning. The sun moved a fraction along the pale stone floor. Persephone sat upright in her plain dove-grey wool, the white lawn fichu just lifting at her quiet breath, the ivory cameo at the long, graceful neck. She let half a minute pass, in the proper composure of a young woman who had not, in 7 years, been asked any question whatever, and would not pretend, this morning, that being asked the 5th was a small thing. She looked once across the room to her brother in the deep window seat. Mortimer gave her the smallest possible nod. No more than the lift of his chin 1/4 of an inch and the steady pressure of his sea-grey blue eyes upon her own. She looked once to the door, where Miss Fairbairn was steadily sewing, the small jet cross at her breast catching the slant of the morning sun. Miss Fairbairn did not look up. She went on with her seam. Persephone returned her clear, sea-grey blue gaze to Lucian at the writing table. She said, in her own soft, warm, low contralto, "Your Grace, I shall freely on my own account. The next 10 years that I named to you in the morning of last Wednesday have not altered. They will, however, in your account of them, become a great deal warmer. I shall accept upon a single condition, that we be married at St. Anselm's, Aldwych, in the 3rd week of April, 1817, 8 months from this morning, to allow the proper
I must
London
apologize for my
correspondence
candor
and
earlier.
the
It was
proper
not my
preparation
intent to
of
cause
my
you
Wiltshire
unease.
affairs,
Your words
and
were
to
clear
allow
and
my father
necessary.
the
I
hours
hold
required
no
for him to
unease.
learn
I'm
that
relieved
he
to hear it.
has, in the matter of his own daughter, given his settled view too readily. We are agreed." Lucian inclined his head. He said, "Madam, we are agreed." He stepped from the writing table. He crossed the pale Wiltshire stone of the floor with his own quiet, considered tread, and stood beside her chair. He took her ungloved right hand in his own gloved right hand, very carefully. He bent his head. He kissed the inside of her wrist. Closed mouth, dignified, his gloved thumb resting steadily at the small turn of her wrist bone. His own breath warm upon the ivory skin, only for the moment of the kiss. He raised his head. Her clear sea-grey blue eyes, very steady, lifted to his. He bent again, more slowly, and kissed her once gently upon the mouth. Closed mouth, upright, the small composed kiss of a man who has been asked 4 questions in 3 days and who has, on the 5th, been freely answered. She did not draw back. She rested her cheek lightly against his temple for the count of 3 seconds, no more, and then withdrew with her own quiet steadiness. Mortimer, in the deep window seat, was steadily looking out upon the home park. Miss Fairbairn was steadily sewing. Lucian withdrew 3 composed steps. He bowed. He said in his own quiet voice, "I shall not press for any more this morning. I shall hope to be allowed to ask for the next in the course of some hereafter, at your own time. She inclined her head. She did not speak. At 11:15, Mortimer went out, upon his friend's quiet instruction, to the long library, where the Earl had been working since breakfast at the home farm accounts, and asked him whether he might be at leisure to receive the Duke of Aldwych at 11 precisely. The Earl looked up. He said, "I shall be." At 11, Lucian crossed from the small library to the larger, with no portfolio and no paper, and stood at the writing table opposite the Earl's chair. The Earl rose. Lucian did not sit. He said, "My lord, I asked your daughter 4 questions on her own account in your library this morning, with her brother present as her chosen witness. I have, on the strength of her composed reply, asked her the 5th. She has accepted me. We propose to be married at St. Anselm's, Aldwych, in the 3rd week of April, 1817. I shall be obliged for your blessing in the proper form. I shall be obliged for nothing further." The Earl stood at his writing table for a long minute. The pale blue eyes settled and watered a little. He drew, at length, the folded white handkerchief from his coat, and pressed it briefly once to his right eye, and then his left, and put it back. He said, in his own slightly worn voice, not handsomely, not yet, but for the first time in 7 years upon this matter, "Aldwych, I have not deserved this morning, and my daughter has not deserved her 7 years. I shall be obliged to you for
I
the
must
years
apologize
it shall
for my
take me to
candour
make the
earlier.
matter
It
right.
was not my intent to
I
cause you
shall be at
unease.
Aldwych on the 23rd
Your words were
of
clear
April,
and necessary.
with
I
whatever
hold them no
flowers the
unease.
Wiltshire dales
I'm
can
relieved to
spare."
hear it.
Lucian inclined his head. He said very quietly, "My lord, the Lady Rowena Winterbourne Foundation will be much obliged for the Wiltshire flowers." The Earl, who had not yet been told of the small private fund his daughter had named to the Duke on the morning of Wednesday last, looked once at the door beyond which his late wife's name had returned to his house in his own daughter's hand, and he inclined his head and did not speak further. Lucian took his leave with the small civil bow, proper between an old Cambridge friend's father and a duke, and withdrew. At noon his travelling chaise stood at the south porch. He took leave of Mortimer in the marble hall, of Miss Fairbairn at the door of the small east drawing-room, of the Earl at the foot of the south stair. Persephone was at the small east drawing-room window, with Miss Fairbairn at her elbow, and Mortimer behind her. She had said, after the small library hour, that she would watch from the window, and Lucian had not pressed her. The chaise rolled out of the avenue at 5 minutes past noon. She stood at the window with her ungloved hands folded at the high round neck of the dove-grey wool gown, and watched the dark, glossy panel pass between the lime trees and out along the white chalk road toward Winchester, until she could no longer see it, and then a little after that. Through the warm, slow weeks of September, the post brought letters from Aldwych House in Park Lane each second day, and Persephone took up the proper London correspondence with quiet, steady purpose. She wrote daily to Lucian, plainly in her clear, even hand, upon the small Wiltshire matters of the home park and the Tacitus and the September weather, and upon the larger matters of the settlements as they came up. He replied in kind. She wrote weekly to Mr. Zachary Hollister at Lincoln's Inn, the silver-grey solicitor in his gold-rimmed spectacles, his plain black superfine, upon the 3 Winterbourne settlement matters, the £10,000 of the 1809 Lady Rowena settlement to be vested in herself alone upon marriage, a separate Aldwych jointure of £4,000 a year to be settled upon her by the Duke, and the formal establishment of the Lady Rowena Winterbourne Foundation, a girls' school at Salisbury endowed from £3,000 of the 10, to bear her late mother's name, and to be administered by trustees including the Reverend Caleb Whittlesey of Aldwych Parish and the Bishop of Sarum's nominee. She wrote to Cecilia in Mount Street upon her sister's quiet engagement to Sir Justin Harvey of Salisbury, privately settled by the middle of the month, and to be publicly announced in the last week of September. She wrote to Daphne and to Eudora upon their own seasons. She wrote to the Bishop of Sarum's chaplain upon the Tacitus, and she completed her translation of Book 4 by the 3rd week of September, which had been the term she had named to the bishop in May. Each morning, she walked in the rose garden with Mortimer, Miss Fairbairn 3 paces behind on the gravel. Each afternoon, she rode out over the home park on her quiet bay mare Cardinal. 15 hands, gentle eye.
I must apologize
the
for my
mare she had
candor
ridden
earlier.
these
It was
last
not my
7
intent to
years
cause
since
you
Lyra had
unease.
been sold by
Your
her
words were
father
clear and
in
necessary. I hold
1809.
no unease.
Each
And I'm
evening
relieved
she
to hear
read
it.
in the small library by candlelight. The Earl was, through September, much at his Wiltshire farms. He addressed his daughter at table now with an apologetic civility she had not, in 7 years, ever heard him use to her, and she returned his civility with quiet steadiness. They spoke, slowly, of the foundation, of Mortimer's plans for the home park, of the Tacitus, of small civil matters that had been 7 years out of practice and were now, by quiet, careful inches, coming back into use. On the evening of Saturday, the 14th of September, Persephone sat at her small mahogany writing desk in her own chamber with the single tall beeswax candle burning warm gold beside her. The cool blue Wiltshire autumn night lay beyond the leaded window. She drew toward her 3 sheets of fine cream-laid paper, and she dipped her pen, and at one quiet sitting, she drafted 3 letters in her clear, even hand. The first was to Lady Cecilia at the Stafford House in Mount Street, congratulating her elder sister upon her quiet engagement to Sir Justin Harvey. The second was to Lucian at Aldwick House in Park Lane, in plain terms, upon the matter of the Lady Rowena Winterbourne Foundation, asking him to lay before Mr. Hollister 3 small additional clauses she had been considering, upon the trustees' annual report, upon a small private bursary for the rector's 2 daughters at Aldwick, and upon the Latin curriculum she wished named in the founding document. The third was to Mr. Hollister at Lincoln's Inn, upon the Winterbourne settlements directly, with the quiet, careful precision of a young woman who had been keeping the home farm books these 2 years. She blotted each in turn. She melted a small pool of dark green wax at the candle. She pressed into each pool the small silver Winterbourne seal, the falcon and quill argent on azure, and laid the 3 letters upon the salver for the Morning Post. She closed her small leather-bound private journal. She set the pen back in its tray. She blew out the candle. She did not yet sleep. She rose in the cool blue starlight from the leaded window and walked once slowly the length of her chamber, from the deep window to the panelled door and back. At the door she stopped. She laid her ungloved right hand once flat upon the cool dark wood of her own door, and let the small living warmth of her own palm sit against the grain of the oak for the length of a quiet breath. She said, very quietly into the cool blue Wiltshire darkness of her own chamber, her first private sentence in this house at 23 since the proposal of Wednesday morning. 8 months. She lowered her hand. She turned. She crossed back to the bed. The post-chaise turned out of the long Wiltshire chalk track at first light on Monday the 14th of October, 1816, and bore Persephone and Miss Prudence Fairbairn over 3 slow days of October weather toward London. The country lay in cold blue autumn, the hedges already half stripped by the
I must
early
apologize
frosts,
for my candor
the
earlier.
rooks
It was not
rising
my
from the
intent to
bare
cause
elm
you
tops
unease.
in the watery
Your words were
sunshine
clear
of
and necessary.
mid-morning.
I hold no
Persephone
unease.
wore a
I'm relieved to
plain
hear
dove-grey wool travelling gown beneath her dark blue mantle, the ivory cameo on its black silk cord at her throat, and a small leather portfolio of letters in her lap. Miss Fairbairn, 60, silver-white hair beneath the small white lace cap, kind round face composed beneath the brim of her plain bonnet, plain black bombazine, white linen apron folded neatly over her knees, the small jet cross at her collar. sat opposite, pale blue eyes very steady upon the changing country. They lay the first night at Andover, the second at Basingstoke, taking their tea in the small private parlours engaged by Mr. Hollister's quiet correspondence with the innkeepers. Miss Fairbairn read aloud from the prayer book in the candlelight of each evening in her brisk, careful voice, and Persephone listened with the small, composed steadiness she had learned in the 7 Wiltshire winters. They reached the outer turnpikes of London on the cold blue afternoon of Wednesday the 16th of October, and the chaise moved by careful inches through the late traffic of Knightsbridge into Mayfair, drawing up at last at 6:30 at the south front of the Aldwych London townhouse off Park Lane. The townhouse stood tall in pale Portland stone above the cold blue twilight, 4 stories of plain Georgian dignity behind a small iron-railed area with 2 coach lamps already lit at the door. The steps had been swept fresh. The brass bell-pull caught the last cold light. Persephone stepped down with her gloved hand on the postilion's arm, the small, composed slowness of her right step settling once upon the pavement and then composing itself by the second. Miss Fairbairn followed with the leather portfolio. The door had already been opened. An under-footman in dark livery was descending for the trunks, and at the head of the steps, with a steady, warm composure and her arms held a little out, stood Lady Hypatia Ashburn Craven. She was 36, soft chestnut-brown hair pinned in a coronet beneath a small grey lace widow's cap, fair, finely lined skin, an oval face that carried the family resemblance to Lucian in its line of jaw and the steady, considering gaze of its emerald green eyes. The same true cool emerald, the same flecks of dark gold in the lamplight, but warmer and quicker than her brother's. She wore lavender silk, half mourning under a fine grey wool shawl against the cold, a white lace fichu at her throat, a small jet brooch with her late husband's hair beneath the glass, and the plain gold wedding band she had not removed in the 2 years since Lord Craven's death. She was medium height, slim, very upright at 5'6". She came down 2 steps to meet Persephone and kissed her on both cheeks in the cold blue October air. "My dear," she said, and her voice was low and clear and very kind. "My brother has written me 3 pages of a young woman who corrected his Tacitus in the rose garden. I am very glad to have you at last under this roof."
I must apologize
Mrs.
for my
Reardon,
candor
the
earlier. It was
housekeeper,
not my intent to
has
cause
the
you
blue guest
unease.
chamber on the
Your
principal
words were
floor
clear
for
and
you.
necessary. I
Miss
hold
Fairbairn
no
shall have
unease,
the small
and
dressing
I'm relieved
chamber
to hear
next
it.
door. We shall give you tea in the small green saloon in 20 minutes. The blue guest chamber lay on the principal floor at the southeast corner of the house, with a tall sash window that gave upon Park Lane and the dark autumn trees of the park beyond. The walls had been hung in a soft, pale blue silk. The 4-poster bed was draped in the same pale blue with white linen sheets newly turned. A walnut writing desk stood beneath the window, a plain pier glass between 2 candles on the chimney-piece. Mrs. Reardon, a careful Sussex woman of 50 in plain black bombazine and a starched white cap, showed Miss Fairbairn through the connecting door into the small dressing chamber where a narrow bed, a small writing table and a deep armchair had been arranged with the same quiet care. Persephone laid off her bonnet and her travelling gloves. Miss Fairbairn unfastened the dark blue mantle and hung it on the cedar press, and at 7:20, with her chestnut hair smoothed at the temples and the ivory cameo settled at her throat, Persephone went down the soft carpeted staircase upon Lady Hypatia's arm to the small green saloon. Lucian was already there. He had come in from the city at 5:30. He had changed. He stood at the chimney-piece in his black evening tailcoat and white cravat, the Aldwych signet on his right hand, a thin gold watch chain at his waistcoat. He came forward at her step. He took her ungloved hand, lifted it to within an inch of his lips, and set it down again upon his sister's arm. His emerald green eyes were very steady. he said in his deep, clear, quiet baritone. Only the 4 words proper to a gentleman receiving his affianced wife under his sister's roof. "You are very welcome." Persephone returned the 4 words proper to a young woman received. "I am very glad." Lady Hypatia poured the tea. So the London weeks began. Through the rest of October and into the soft, cold Novembers of Mayfair, Persephone kept her own quiet, daily routine within the steady armour of Lady Hypatia's house. She rose at 7. She took her plain breakfast at 8:30 in the small green saloon with Miss Fairbairn. She answered her London correspondence at the walnut writing desk by the tall sash window from 9 to noon. She read in the drawing-room from 12 to 2. Sophocles in the autumn, Antigone first, and afterwards Oedipus at Colonus, in the small leather Oxford edition Lucian had laid upon her desk on her second morning. At 2, she dressed for the afternoon. At 3, she walked. She walked in Hyde Park. Lucian came each afternoon at 2:45, in his dark walnut-brown country coat, his buff waistcoat, his brown-topped boots, and gave her his right arm at the foot of the front steps. They went out at the Park Lane gate, crossed the carriage drive in the cold blue October sun, and turned into the long gravel walk under the still leafed plains. He kept her gloved hand at the crook of his arm. He walked at her pace. The polite world watched, twice, from its open carriages and from the bridle path.
I must
and from the
apologize for my
small
candor
private
earlier.
benches.
It was not my intent to
The
cause you
tall,
unease.
composed Duke
Your
of
words were
Aldwych
clear and
on the
necessary.
Park
I
Lane
hold
gravel
no
of a
unease.
Wednesday
I'm
afternoon
relieved
at
to hear
3, in dark walnut, with on his right arm a slender, chestnut-haired young woman of 23, in a plain dark blue pelisse and a small bonnet, the ivory cameo at her throat, her step a fractional half-second slower at the start of the walk, and, by the second turn under the planes, scarcely visible at all. The polite world watched twice. The polite world ceased to remark. It had been Lucian's quiet doing. He had let it be known, in 3 private mornings at his club and in 2 careful letters to the houses that mattered, that the lively figures of a London assembly were not to be required of his affianced wife, that Lady Persephone would take dinners and small evenings at his sister's house and at 3 or 4 others, and that the matter of the larger ballrooms was, by his settled understanding, not in question. The polite world, with the polite world's quick adjustment of its expectations, had accepted the fact within a fortnight. Lady Hypatia had smiled once over her tea, very dryly, and observed that her brother had always known how to settle a question without raising his voice. 3 small Mayfair dinners were given through the late autumn at houses Lady Hypatia trusted. The first was at the Earl of Marchmont's in Grosvenor Square. 12 at table, Persephone in soft, blush-pink silk evening, the cameo, her late mother's small pearl and coral drop earrings, her chestnut hair smoothed in the low chignon she always kept. She spoke twice at the table and 3 times after. She listened with steady composure. Lord Marchmont, an old college friend of Lucian's father, leaned to his wife at the close of the evening and observed that the Aldwych choice had been made by a man who had taken the trouble to see what he was choosing. The second dinner was at Lady Hypatia's own table, 14, including Mr. Hollister, the Bishop of Sarum's London chaplain, and 2 careful Mayfair widows whom Hypatia had chosen for their tongues. The third was at the Marquis of Stowcliffe's in Berkeley Square. 16 at table, the Marchioness took Persephone privately into her morning room afterwards and told her, with an old woman's directness, that she had been at Lady Rowena Winterbourne's wedding breakfast in the May of 1791, and that Lady Rowena had been the most quietly accurate young woman she had ever known, and that her daughter had inherited it, and that the matter was therefore in order. On Wednesday the 12th of November, 1816, Lady Guinevere Stafford, 48, glossy chestnut-brown hair under a fashionable lace cap, large pale grey eyes settled in their snobberies, alabaster lightly powdered, conventionally handsome at her age, medium 5'7", slim, gave her own dinner of the season at the Stafford House in Mount Street. 28 to dinner. She had drawn up the list with care. The Earl had come up to town for the season and was at the Stafford House through the week. Cecilia was there in soft Wiltshire blue silk evening, the small private engagement to Sir Justin Harvey already settled, the public announcement only awaiting the proper hour. Daphne in pale pink silk,
I must
Eudora
apologize
in
for
pale
my
yellow,
candor earlier.
their
It was not
gold
my
blonde
intent to
heads
cause you
bright at
unease.
the long
Your
candlelit
words were
table.
clear and necessary.
Persephone
I
in her
hold no
soft
unease.
blush pink
I'm
silk,
relieved to hear it.
evening with the ivory cameo, and her late mother's pearl and coral drop earrings. Lucian in black evening tailcoat with the Aldwych signet, and, at the south end of the table, in a dark claret tailcoat that did not quite fit him at the shoulders, Lord Barnaby Winterbourne, sandy grey hair carefully oiled forward, watery blue eyes, sallow with the broken veins of his long claret evenings, the soft paunch beneath the primrose waistcoat, admitted at the door at 6 o'clock. Out of the strict family civility, his sister-in-law was unwilling to refuse him in his brother's presence. Dinner went through its proper 5 removes in proper Mount Street order. Lady Guinevere kept the table to a steady civil hum. Persephone spoke when addressed. She spoke once across the table to Cecilia upon the September Tacitus letters, and once to the Bishop of Saroome's London chaplain, who was at Lady Guinevere's left hand, upon a small point of Latin idiom in Book 5, and otherwise sat in her quiet composure between Lucian and Mortimer, who had come up from Wiltshire for the week. Lord Barnaby attempted no speech at table. He drank his claret with the steady method of long practice. His pale eyes moved twice along the table to his niece, and twice to the Duke beside her, and twice slid away again. When the ladies withdrew to the saloon at 9:30, Lady Guinevere placed her chair with quiet purpose beside Persephone's on the rose silk sofa. She allowed a polite quarter hour to pass. She allowed Cecilia to be drawn away to the pianoforte by Eudora. She allowed Daphne to take Lady Hypatia into the small antechamber upon a question of a fan. Then she leaned a little closer, in the manner of an aunt about to speak with practised concern, and said in her low, gracious voice the sentences she had drafted in her own head 3 days before. "My dear, I have been told by your aunt's friends in town that the Aldwych stables are to keep a quiet old hunter for your private use at Sussex. I had thought you would have given up the riding entirely after, well, your unfortunate accident." The saloon held its small civil murmur about them. The candles in the brackets cast their soft, warm gold upon the rose silk, and the pale grey eyes very steady upon Persephone's face. Persephone did not look at her aunt for a moment. She turned her gloved hands once upon her lap, the small composed gesture she had used in her father's library at Winterbourne in August. Then she lifted her clear, sea-grey blue eyes to Lady Guinevere's pale grey ones, and she answered in her own clear, quiet voice, evenly and without hurry, in the steady steel that had been earned in 7 Wiltshire winters. "Aunt, I gave up the riding in 1808 against my own preference and upon my father's settled view. His Grace has, with my own consent, undertaken to restore it to me at Aldwych, upon the quietest hunter the Sussex stables can keep. I shall ride again at my own pace, in my own park, in my own time. I do not require, for that programme, the sanction of any aunt or any London opinion." The saloon
I must
did not
apologize for my
pause.
candor
The
earlier. It was not my
pianoforte
intent to cause you
continued its
unease.
quiet Haydn
Your words were
under
clear and
Eudora's
necessary.
fingers.
I hold no
The
unease.
candles continued
I'm
their
relieved to hear
soft
it.
burn. Lady Hypatia, returning from the antechamber, took her seat by the chimney-piece without a flicker of her shrewd, warm, emerald-green eyes. But Lady Guinevere's pale grey gaze fell first upon her gloved hands and then upon the rose silk of the sofa arm, and she did not raise it again to Persephone's face that evening. She rose, after a moment, upon a small civil pretext, and went to the pianoforte. She did not return to the rose silk sofa. She did not, in the months that followed, present herself at Aldwych House. In the smoking room beyond the dining room at the same hour, Lord Barnaby had drawn the Earl into the deep window bay upon the strength of the third glass of port and a small private speech he had been preparing through October. He spoke of the Aldwych connection in the language of nephewly concern. He spoke of the autumn and the proper considerations of family settlements. He spoke at last of the £10,000 in the event the wedding does not take place. The Earl set down his own glass. He looked for the first time in many years, with the steady pale blue gaze of the head of his house, upon his younger brother's sallow face. He said, in the plain Wiltshire candour he had spent 7 years not exercising in this matter, that the wedding shall take place. That the wedding had been settled in his own library on the morning of the 4th of September, by his daughter on her own account, in her brother's witness. That Lord Barnaby had no claim of any kind upon his niece's settlement, and that Lord Barnaby, as the Earl's own brother, would be obliged in the name of what remained of the family civility between them, to leave the subject alone for the rest of his life. He spoke for 7 minutes. He did not raise his voice once. He set his glass back on the small mahogany table by the window when he had finished. Lord Barnaby's sallow face went the colour of poor claret. He left the Stafford house at 10:30, his coat fetched in haste, with a face like a thundercloud over Mount Street. Through the rest of November, and through December, and through January, at Aldwych House, the days kept their composed shape. Persephone rose at 7. She breakfasted with Miss Fairbairn in the small green saloon at 8:30. She answered her London correspondence at the walnut writing desk from 9 to noon. The foundation was now formally named the Lady Rowena Winterbourne Foundation, with a parcel of 112 acres of good chalk, down-settled near Salisbury upon the trust, with the Reverend Caleb Whittlesey of Aldwych Parish and the Bishop of Sarham's nominee among the trustees, with the small private bursary for the rector's 2 daughters at Aldwych written in, and with the Latin curriculum named in the founding clause as Persephone had wished. Mr. Hollister drafted the deed of trust through December and lodged it at Lincoln's Inn in the first week of January, 1817. Persephone read in the drawing-room from 12 to 2, Sophocles through the late autumn, Euripides
I must
through the new
apologize
year,
for my candour earlier.
Iphigenia
It was not my
at
intent to
Aulis in
cause you
January,
unease.
in the
Your
same
words were
small
clear and
leather
necessary.
Oxford
I
edition,
hold no
by the
unease,
same warm
and I'm
fire.
relieved to hear it.
She corresponded twice a week with the Bishop of Sarham's chaplain on the Tacitus translation, which had now extended into Book 5. The chaplain returned her drafts with a small, careful pencil and a steady, deferential admiration. She walked in Hyde Park each afternoon at 3, with Lucian on her right side. The polite world had, by the new year, ceased to look at her at all in the long sense. It looked only with the small civil nod proper to a Duchess-elect of Aldwych walking in her own park in the proper season, and Persephone returned the nod with the same composed civility she would carry into Sussex in the spring. Lady Hypatia in residence in lavender silk through the season, Miss Fairbairn at her elbow each morning, Lucian at her elbow each evening. Through the middle of January, beneath this composed daily order, a smaller, quieter correspondence had been moving between Lincoln's Inn and a small pair of London men of business in Holborn. Lord Barnaby, his thundercloud face having settled into a longer, sullen weather since the Mount Street dinner, had retained, upon a paper claim, a London attorney named Mr. Slingsby of Holborn, and Mr. Slingsby, upon Lord Barnaby's careful instructions, had begun to draft letters of polite inquiry to Mr. Hollister upon a matter of family settlement of long standing. Mr. Hollister had answered them with the steady civil opacity proper to a Lincoln's Inn man dealing with a paper claim of no foundation. Through the back of his returning letters, however, Mr. Hollister had set quietly in motion the standard discovery proper to the matter, and by the last week of January he had obtained, through a careful, courteous application to one of the 2 Holborn men of business, a Mr. Tewson, who upon receiving Mr. Hollister's polite inquiry had, rather than face the libel suit, produced his correspondence willingly, copies of Lord Barnaby's own letters of the late January of 1817, drafted in Lord Barnaby's hand and going forth at the start of February, in which Lord Barnaby plainly described his intention to extract a settlement of inconvenience from the Aldwych estate before the bans are read. Mr. Hollister had read the copies twice in the lamplight of his Lincoln's Inn rooms, set them in a small leather wallet, and sent the wallet across to Park Lane by his own clerk on the morning of Monday the 24th of February. The wallet was upon Lucian's writing desk in the library at Aldwych House by 10 that morning. Lucian had read it once at noon, once at 4, and once again at 9 in the evening, after Persephone had gone up at 10 on Miss Fairbairn's arm, and after Lady Hypatia had bidden him good night at 11 from the door of the library, with her shrewd, warm, emerald-green eyes very steady upon his face. The house had settled by the quarter past. Beyond the leaded library window, the cold, blue London winter night.
I must
lay
apologize for
heavy
my
upon
candor
Park
earlier.
Lane.
It was not my
The
intent to
dark
cause you
autumn
unease.
trees of the park
Your words were
bare
clear and
against the
necessary.
lamps.
I hold no
The small
unease,
frost
and
had
I'm relieved to
begun
hear
in
it.
the gutters. Lucian sat now alone at the long writing desk before the library window at 11:30 on the evening of Monday the 24th of February, 1817. The single tall beeswax candle had burned low in its plain silver stick. He wore his black evening tailcoat still. His white cravat had not been loosened. The Aldwych signet caught the candle on his right hand. He had been answering Mr. Hollister's morning report. A single sheet of fine cream, laid paper, in Mr. Hollister's narrow scholar's hand, summarising the contents of Lord Barnaby's intercepted letters and proposing the canonical paper interview at Aldwych House on Friday the 7th of March. The intercepted letters themselves lay in the small enamelled box at his elbow. A plain green and gold enamelled snuff-box he had emptied that afternoon for the purpose, the lid closed, the small brass key in the drawer. His own answer to Mr. Hollister was now sanded, blotted, folded and sealed with the dark green Aldwych wax under the sea falcon over the chalk pail. He laid it upon the salver for the morning post. He set the pen back in its tray. He looked once down the length of the dark library to the ember of the dying fire in the grate. He looked once toward the door, beyond which his sister had gone up, and the staircase beyond which Persephone slept under Miss Fairbairn's careful care. He did not move for a long, quiet moment. The candle burned down a small fraction. He said then, very quietly, in his own deep, clear, quiet baritone, his only private sentence at his own desk that evening, into the cold, blue London winter dark of his own library at 11:30 on the 24th of February. "Tomorrow, Hollister. Aldwych. We shall settle him in a single morning." He pinched the candle out between his thumb and forefinger. The library went dark. Beyond the leaded window, the cold blue winter night lay quiet over Park Lane. The cold, pale blue London March came up over Park Lane on Friday the 7th of March, 1817. The bare plane trees unbudded, the iron rails touched with the small grey frost of dawn, the lamps just put out, the long-windowed library at Aldwych House standing already prepared for the canonical paper interview the Duke of Aldwych and Mr. Zachary Hollister of Lincoln's Inn had appointed for 11. The library had been swept and the fire built up at 6. The long writing table at the centre had been laid with 2 sheets of fine cream, laid paper, a fresh-cut pen, the dark green Aldwych wax. The rosewood writing table by the second, lidded window had been drawn out from its recess. 2 mahogany chairs at the chimney-piece had been set for the secondary witnesses. The side table at the wall had been laid with green baize for the solicitor's portfolio. There were no weapons in the room. Lucian Ashburn, 6th Duke of Aldwych, had come down at 10:30. Black, superfine morning coat, sober and exactly cut, white cravat tied in its proper
I must
folds,
apologize for my
black
candor
silk
earlier. It
waistcoat
was not my
smooth
intent
above
to cause you
charcoal
unease.
pantaloons,
Your words were
polished
clear and
black Hessian
necessary.
boots,
I hold the
the
no
heavy
unease.
silver
I'm
Aldwick
relieved to hear
ducal
it.
signet ring with the sea falcon over the chalk pale upon the second finger of his right hand. His thick, dark bronze-brown wavy hair had been brushed close at the nape. One lock had fallen across his brow. The faint silver at the right temple caught the cold light. His clear, deep, emerald green eyes were very steady. Lady Persephone Winterbourne had come down at 11:15 on Miss Fairbairn's arm and had been seated, by Lucian's hand, at the rosewood by the second leaded window. She wore her plain dark blue morning gown, with the white lawn fichu folded close at the throat, the small ivory cameo of her late mother Lady Rowena upon its thin black silk cord, her chestnut hair pinned smooth in the low chignon, her hands ungloved and folded on the polished rosewood. Her clear sea-grey blue eyes rested steadily on the dust motes in the cold pale sun across the carpet. She had walked in from the small saloon by the longer route, her right step the fractional composed quarter-second slower than her left, and had seated herself with the upright, unhurried courtesy of a young woman of 23 who had said only the evening before that the matter might not be settled in any room in which she was not at the leaded window. Lady Hypatia Ashburn, craven in her widow's lavender silk, half mourning under the small grey lace cap, sat in the central armchair with her sewing, a plain hem of white lawn upon a linen cap for the parish poorhouse, the needle moving at the steady three-stitch rhythm she had used since girlhood. Viscount Mortimer Winterbourne, down from Wiltshire by his own express on the 5th, sat at his sister's elbow in his dark green country coat, his sea-grey blue eyes, the brother's pair to hers, very steady upon the door. Mr. Zachary Hollister stood at the side table in the plain black superfine of his profession. Thinning silver-grey hair, smooth above gold-rimmed spectacles. Steady grey eyes, very quiet. The leather portfolio had been opened. Within it, he had laid in proper order the certified copy of the Winterbourne Family Settlement Papers of 1798, obtained through the Bishop of Sarum's diocesan registrar at Salisbury the previous Wednesday. The Lady Rowena Winterbourne settlement of 1809 in its original signed indenture. The green leather wallet of copies of Lord Barnaby's intercepted letters of February 1817, supplied through Mr. Tewson of Holborn rather than face the libel suit, and a separate folder concerning the late 5th Duke of Aldwick's account books for 1799. Reverend Caleb Whittlesey, Vicar of St. Anselm's, Aldwick, 53, had come up from Sussex on the night coach at Lucian's request, and sat in the second mahogany chair, in black clerical coat, white collar band, the small silver crucifix on its silk cord, his soft sandy grey hair neatly cut, his hazel eyes behind their gold-rimmed spectacles resting upon the carpet. The Earl, Lord Caspar Winterbourne, sent for from Wiltshire by Lucian's letter of the 25th of February, sat at this hour in the morning room
I
next
must
door,
apologize for my
in
candor
dark
earlier.
blue
It was
morning
not my
coat,
intent to
white
cause you
cravat,
unease.
dove
Your
grey
words were
waistcoat,
clear and necessary.
folded
I
hands
hold the
quite
no
still
unease.
upon his knees.
I'm relieved to hear
He
it.
was to be brought in only if the second head of the demolition required it. The long case clock struck 11. The butler opened the door. Lord Barnaby Winterbourne, Your Grace. Lord Barnaby came in. He wore his dark brown wool tailcoat with worn gilt buttons, his primrose yellow waistcoat slightly stained, his buff pantaloons creased from the chaise, his top boots unpolished. His thinning, sandy grey hair had been oiled forward over the bald patch. His small, shallow, watery blue eyes moved once round the room, and the practised half-smile of self-importance with which he had crossed the threshold faltered at the sight of the clergyman. He recovered. He bowed, the careful uncle's bow, slightly too low. He prepared the opening of his 40-minute speech. He got, in the event, 11 sentences. He claimed first a private memorandum from his late mother, the bride's grandmother, the late Countess Lady Seraphina Winterbourne, née Westbury, deceased 1808, drawn up at Winterbourne in 1798, settling £10,000 upon any Winterbourne daughter who should remain unmarried at 30, of which sum he believed himself the proper trustee. He claimed second a verbal commitment from his elder brother Lord Caspar of 1812, acknowledging him as the natural trustee of any unmarried Winterbourne daughters' settlements. He proposed third, with the small private smile of a man performing a courtesy, a private settlement of family inconvenience of £6,000, to be paid to himself before the wedding banns should be read at St. Anselm's, Aldwick, on Sunday the 6th of April. Mr. Hollister inclined his head, set his pen aside, opened the leather portfolio, and began. The first head, the 1798 Grandmother's Memorandum. Mr. Hollister produced the certified copy of the Winterbourne family settlement papers of 1798. He laid the copy upon the table. He turned, in Lord Barnaby's full view, to the only paper of 1798 the archive contained. There was no such memorandum. There had never been such a memorandum. The 1798 papers contained only the standard provisions for jointure and pin money for the late Countess Lady Seraphina Winterbourne, who had died in the autumn of 1808, leaving no instrument affecting any granddaughter's portion. The £10,000 was the 1809 Lady Rowena settlement, drawn up 4 months before Lady Rowena's death in childbed of January 1809, vested in Lady Persephone, Eleanor Winterbourne alone. Mr. Hollister set the paper down. He looked once, mildly, at Lord Barnaby. Lord Barnaby's mouth moved once in a small dry way, and he did not speak. The second head, the verbal commitment of 1812. Mr. Hollister observed, very dryly, that no English court entertained a verbal commitment of the kind described without 2 corroborating witnesses sworn under oath.
I must
And Lord
apologize for my
Barnaby
candor
had
earlier.
named
It was
none.
not my intent to cause
The
you
Earl was at
unease.
this hour in the
Your words were
morning room
clear
next
and
door,
necessary. I
ready
hold
to
with
be
no
brought in
unease,
to contradict
and I'm
the
relieved to
claim
hear
under
it.
his own signature. Mr. Hollister rose, crossed to the door, opened it, and stood aside. The Earl came in. He took the seat next to Mortimer without speaking. He faced his brother across the room. Lord Barnaby, who had not seen the Earl since the December Wiltshire visit, and had supposed, upon the general silence of his elder brother, that the Earl knew nothing of the present arrangement, blinked once and discovered, with the small private cold of a man who has miscounted his cards, that the Earl was on the other side of the room and not on his. The third head, the family inconvenience. Mr. Hollister produced the Lady Rowena settlement of 1809. He read aloud the relevant clause, that the £10,000 settled by Lady Rowena upon her 4th daughter Persephone, Eleanor reverted to her alone upon her marriage and to her husband's settlements. That should she not marry before 30, the sum should fall to the next of male kin at that birthday, but not before. Lady Persephone was 23. The wedding had been fixed for Wednesday the 23rd of April, 1817, 7 weeks from this morning. The £10,000 reverted to Lady Persephone in 7 weeks. Lord Barnaby had no claim of any kind that any English court would entertain. The fourth head, the £6,000 demand. Mr. Hollister observed that an attempt to extract money under implied threat constituted, under the statute of 1812, the criminal offence of extortion. He produced from the green leather wallet copies of Lord Barnaby's own letters to the 2 London men of business of February 1817, in which Lord Barnaby plainly described, in his own hand, his intention to extract a settlement of inconvenience from the Aldwick estate before the banns were read. He read, briefly, the relevant sentences. He read the date. He read the address. He read the signature. He laid the copies on the table. Lord Barnaby, who had drafted the originals himself in the parlour of his Winchester lodgings on the evenings of the 28th and 29th of January, recognised the sentences. His sallow face lost the small remaining colour about the cheekbones. He did not speak. Lucian rose. He came round the writing table. He stood at his full height in the black, superfine morning coat, the Aldwych signet steady upon his right hand. He looked, without anger and without haste, at Lord Barnaby across the cold, pale London light of his own library, and he spoke in his deep, clear, quiet baritone. "Sir, you have, for 7 years, encouraged your brother to keep his daughter at Wiltshire upon the calculation that she would not marry before 30, and that you might, in time, have a private claim upon her settlement. You have, in the 8 months since I came down to your brother's house in August last, attempted to keep her at Wiltshire by a series of small private slanders. You have this
I must
morning,
apologize
in
for
my
my
own
candour
library,
earlier.
in
It was
front
not
of
my
my
intent to
affianced
cause you
wife,
unease.
my sister,
Your words were
her
clear
brother,
and necessary.
her
I hold
father,
no unease.
my solicitor,
I'm relieved to hear
and
it.
my parish vicar, proposed to me that I pay you £6,000 for your silence regarding a matter in which you have no proper interest. You will leave Aldwych House by 12:30. You will not write to me, to my wife, to her family, or to any other party connected with this matter, in any year of your remaining life. Should you write, the libel suit will be lodged in Lincoln's Inn within 7 days upon your own letters of February. Should you appear at Aldwych House, or at Aldwych Park, or at Winterbourne Hall, you will be removed by my steward and the second footman, and the matter laid before the magistrates. We are agreed." Lord Barnaby stood for 4 seconds with his watery blue eyes upon the polished black Hessian boots of the man who had spoken. He attempted then his final bluff, an alleged old debt of 200 guineas owed by the late 5th Duke of Aldwych to his own late father, Mr. Augustus Winterbourne, in the autumn of 1799, never settled. Mr. Hollister did not rise. He drew from the separate folder the 3 sheets concerning the late 5th Duke of Aldwich's account books for 1799, consulted by Mr. Sylvanus Mercer on the 2nd of March. He read aloud, briefly, the said debt did not exist. The late 5th Duke of Aldwych had had no transactions of any kind with Lord Barnaby or with the late Mr. Augustus Winterbourne in 1799, or in any year before or after. The account books, kept in the late Duke's own clear hand, were available for inspection. The bluff collapsed. Lord Barnaby went white. He withdrew, in the small, thin voice of a man who had run out of cards. His offer. He bowed stiffly to Persephone at the rosewood. She did not look at him. Her clear, sea-grey blue eyes rested upon the dust motes in the cold, pale sun across the carpet, exactly where they had rested before he came in. He bowed to the Earl. The Earl returned the bow with the smallest possible inclination of the head, no more than the breadth of a shilling. He bowed to Lucian. Lucian returned the inclination with an even smaller. The butler opened the library door. Lord Barnaby walked down the marble hall, took his beaver hat from the under-footman, walked out into the cold, pale blue London march of Park Lane, and was gone by 12 o'clock. He never returned to Aldwych House, to Aldwych Park, or to Winterbourne Hall. He wrote, as it happened, no letter at all on the subject in any year of his remaining life. The library settled. Reverend Caleb Whittlesey rose. He came down 2 paces. He looked once at Lucian, once at the closed door, once at the ivory cameo at the throat of the young woman at the rosewood. He spoke the single sentence required of a parish vicar in the matter. "Your Grace, I have had the privilege this morning of seeing the law remember its proper purpose." Lucian inclined his head. Mr. Hollister gathered his papers, returned
must
each
apologize
to the
for my
leather
candor
portfolio,
earlier. It was not my
bowed once
intent
to
to
the
cause you
Duke,
unease.
and once to the
Your words were
Duchess-elect,
clear and necessary.
and
I
withdrew
hold
through the
no
door to the
unease.
small
I'm
saloon.
relieved to hear it.
Lady Hypatia, on a small private signal of her brother's eye, folded her sewing, rose, smiled once gravely at Persephone, and withdrew through the same door. Reverend Whittlesey, at the same signal, withdrew through the door to the morning room. Mortimer rose to withdraw with them. Persephone caught his hand briefly in her own ungloved right and held him in his place. He sat. The Earl rose from the chair next to Mortimer. He crossed the carpet at the slow, upright pace of a man of 56 who had, at last, a thing to say to his fourth daughter at her own pace and not his. He stopped 2 paces from her. He looked, for the first time in 8 months, into her clear, steady, sea-grey blue eyes, the colour of Wiltshire chalk stream water in late summer, that had been the colour of her own dead mother's eyes. And he spoke, in his own quiet voice, the only sentences he had. Persephone, I have not deserved, in any week of 7 years, the daughter you have been to me. I shall not ask for your forgiveness this morning. I shall ask only this, to permit me to spend the years remaining to me trying to deserve it. You have, in 8 days at Winterbourne in August, taught me, and the man you are about to marry has taught me, that I had given my settled view of you upon a single fall in October 1808 and had refused, in the 7 years since, to revise it. I shall be at Aldwick on the 23rd of April, with whatever flowers the Wiltshire dales can spare. I shall, however, walk behind you, and behind your brother, and behind Miss Fairbairn, and behind Lady Hypatia, in the procession to St. Anselm's, for that is the place I have earned. I shall not ask to walk anywhere else. She listened. She did not weep. She did not lower her eyes. The composed, quiet asymmetry of her right side was not greater nor less in this moment than it had been the August evening he had spoken his 11 sentences at his Wiltshire chimney-piece. Her clear, sea-grey blue eyes rested upon her father's pale blue ones for a long minute that was 2 40 by the long-case clock, and the cold, pale London March light moved once across the carpet between them. And she gave him her hand. She set her ungloved right hand upon his, palm down, the pale fingers steady against his lined ones, and she said, in her own clear, quiet voice, the answer she had thought, while listening, was the only one she would offer. Father, I forgive you. I shall be glad of the Wiltshire flowers. I shall be glad of you behind me in the procession. I shall not, however, sit you anywhere but at my own right hand at the wedding breakfast. We shall not, between this morning and the 23rd of April, speak of the matter again. He bent. He kissed her hand, briefly. He straightened. He inclined his head once to Mortimer. He walked to the morning-room door at the slow, upright pace of a man given, by the daughter he had not deserved, the place he had earned.
I must
door
apologize for
closed
my
behind
candor
him.
earlier. It was not my intent to
Lucian,
cause you unease.
who had stood very
Your
still
words
at the
were
writing
clear and
table
necessary.
through the
I
apology,
hold no unease.
came down to the
and I'm
rosewood.
relieved to hear it.
He stood at her right side. He took her ungloved right hand up in his own. He held it for half a minute in the cold, pale blue London March light. Persephone, 7 weeks. Her clear, sea-grey blue eyes lifted to his. 7 weeks, Lucian. The cold, pale blue London March turned into the cold, pale blue Sussex April. The party came down out of London by post-chaise upon the Brighton Road and arrived at Aldwick Park in the long, pale evening of Thursday the 3rd of April, 1817, with the first new April leaf upon the Chestnut Avenue and the first narcissi at the chapel step of St. Anselm's, Aldwick. Mrs. Jemima Hardcastle, 60, stood at the steps of the Palladian house of pale Sussex sandstone. Iron grey hair smooth under the starched white linen cap, warm pale grey eyes steady upon the chaise, fair Sussex weathered kind round face, composed, Short, stout, brisk, 5'2", upright in plain black bombazine, white linen apron, the bunch of keys on the silver chatelaine. Mr. Sylvanus Mercer, 54, stood at her right shoulder, close-cropped, iron-grey hair, bare-headed, steady, pale blue eyes, Sussex-weathered, tanned, square, honest, clean-shaven face, his 5'10" broad-standing square in dark brown wool country coat, buff waistcoat, brown leather gaiters. Behind them stood the 30 servants of Aldwych Park in their proper order down the long, shallow flight. Persephone stepped down on Lucian's hand, chestnut hair pinned smooth under a dark blue silk bonnet, white kid travelling gloves, pale primrose-yellow muslin morning gown, white lawn fichu folded close with the ivory cameo above it. She stood for one breath in the gravel, looked once up the long Palladian front, and turned to Mrs. Hardcastle. Mrs. Hardcastle curtsied. "Welcome to Aldwych, Lady Persephone. Your fire has been lit in the blue guest chamber since 6. Persephone gave her her hand. She went along the line of 30 servants. She gave each her hand. She spoke to each by name. Mrs. Hardcastle had sent up the household list on the 20th of March, with a small character of each, and Persephone had held the names quiet in her composed memory through the journey down. She did not miss one. She spoke a single small sentence of welcome to each, to Mrs. Wenlock, the cook upon the cherry pies of the orchard, to Mrs. Tyrrell, the dairymaid upon the Sussex bred milk cows, to Mr. Bartholomew, the head gardener upon the walled rose garden, and received each composed reply with the steady attention of a young woman who had kept a Wiltshire Home Farms books for 2 years before she came. Mrs. Hardcastle that evening, in the steward's room over supper at 8:30, looked once across the deal table at Mr. Mercer. "Mr. Mercer, we have a duchess." She did not miss one of them. The late duchess would have been pleased. Mr. Mercer inclined his iron-grey head once. The wedding clothes were finished by Tuesday the 8th of April by Madame
I must
Aubin
apologize
of
for
Bond
my
Street,
candour
and her
earlier.
2
It was not my
assistants brought
intent to
down
cause
on
you
Saturday.
unease. Your
The
words were
ivory
clear
silk
and
wedding
necessary.
gown with
I
short
hold no
puff
unease,
sleeves and
and
a
I'm
narrow
relieved to
row
hear it.
of antique seed pearls at the hem, the white silk gloves to the elbow, the small coronet of white spring narcissus and pale green myrtle laid in white lawn in the silk box upon the dressing chest. Reverend Caleb Whittlesey read the first banns at St. Anselm's Aldwych on the 6th of April, the second on the 13th, the third on Palm Sunday the 20th, before Persephone herself, in her dove-grey morning gown in the Aldwych pew under the small lancet window. On the cold, pale blue Sussex spring evening of Saturday the 19th of April, 1817, 4 days before the wedding, Persephone stood at the leaded window of the blue guest chamber at 11:30. The cold, pale blue sun had set an hour before, behind the South Downs. The first stars had come out clean and quiet. The chestnut avenue was a dark, even line. The chamber stood quiet about her, the fire low in the grate, the single beeswax candle on the dressing chest, the wedding silk folded in its silk box, Miss Fairbairn long since gone up. Persephone wore her cream cashmere shawl over her plain dove-grey evening gown. Her chestnut hair was pinned smooth in the low chignon. Her white kid evening gloves had been drawn against the night cold. The ivory cameo lay on the silk cord at her throat. She lifted her gloved right hand. She laid it upon the cold glass for one long breath. The cold of the Sussex April night came through the white kid against her palm. She looked once down the dark line of the chestnut avenue, once up to the first quiet stars over the South Downs, and she said, very quietly, into the cold, pale blue spring dark of her own future house at 23, her first private sentence in the rooms that would, on Wednesday morning, be her own. "I have been asked. I have answered. I shall on Wednesday morning sign." She took her gloved hand down from the glass. The fire had burned to a steady rose. Beyond the window, the cold, pale blue Sussex night lay quiet over the South Downs, and the blue guest chamber stood ready for the morning of the 23rd of April. The cold, pale blue Sussex spring sky lay clean over the South Downs on the morning of Wednesday, the 23rd of April, 1817. The first soft greens had come along the slopes of the downland. The chestnut avenue at Aldwych Park had broken into fresh April leaf, and at the step of St. Anselm's, Aldwych, the first April narcissi had opened, white among the pale green myrtle that Mr. Bartholomew had set out the evening before in earthenware bowls on the south side of the porch. The chapel stood small and quiet upon its 12th century foundation of pale Sussex sandstone, the low square Norman tower rising scarcely above the chestnut avenue, the narrow lancet windows admitting the cold, pale blue spring light in clean even bars across the polished oak pews that 7 centuries of Aldwych worshippers had worn smooth. At each pew end, by the careful hand of
I must
Mr.
apologize for
Bartholomew,
my candor
a small
earlier. It was not
posy
my
of
intent
white
to cause
spring
you unease.
narcissus and
Your words
pale
were
green
clear and
myrtle had been
necessary.
bound
I
with
hold
white
no
silk
unease.
ribbon.
I'm relieved to
2
hear it.
tall brass candlesticks had been set at the altar by Mrs. Jemima Hardcastle herself, and the lit beeswax candles laid a warm, steady gold against the cold, pale blue light of the lancet windows. The Aldwych tenants and the parish villagers filled the chapel to the doors, the men in Sunday black wool, the women in their best plain print gowns, the children pressed close against their mothers' skirts in the back pews. The bells of St. Anselm's began at 9:30. Aldwych Park had been in quiet stir from 6. Mrs. Hardcastle had had every fire lit. The kitchen had its goose upon the spit, a saddle of mutton, 2 game pies, 4 loaves, 6 Sussex cheeses, 6 bottles of port, and 4 of the late 5th Duke's 1809 claret decanted in the butler's pantry. The great hall had been decked since 5, with white spring narcissus and pale green myrtle along the gallery rail and the long oak table. In the blue guest chamber on the principal floor, at 9:30, Lady Persephone Eleanor Winterbourne stood quiet before the long mirror, while Miss Prudence Fairbairn and Lady Hypatia Ashburn Craven attended her. She wore her high-waisted ivory silk wedding gown with its short puff sleeves and the single narrow row of small antique seed pearls embroidered at the hem, her plain white silk gloves drawn close to the elbow, her chestnut hair pinned smooth in its low chignon at the nape, and into it Lady Hypatia had set the small coronet of white spring narcissus and pale green myrtle. At her ears were her late mother's pearl and coral drop earrings. At her throat, a single strand of small antique seed pearls, and beneath the bodice, against her own steady heart, lay the ivory cameo upon its black silk cord. Lady Hypatia took up the heirloom Aldwych blonde lace veil of 1782 from its silk paper upon the dressing chest. She lifted it, light as breath, and pinned it with 2 small pearl pins to the coronet, the lace falling clean and even down Persephone's chestnut hair to the small of her back. She stepped away. She regarded her brother's chosen bride for one long, composed minute. Persephone. The veil belonged to my mother and her mother before her. It has waited 35 years for a Duchess of Aldwych to wear it next. It has not waited badly. Persephone inclined her head 1/4 inch. Thank you, Hypatia. Miss Fairbairn, in her best black bombazine with the small jet brooch at her throat, took her companion's gloved hand for one steady breath, said nothing at all, and stepped back to her proper place. The procession formed in the long stone hall at 5 minutes before 10. Viscount Mortimer Winterbourne stood in his dark green country coat at his sister's left, his sea-grey blue eyes very steady, his offered arm composed beneath her gloved hand. Behind them, in the dark blue morning coat and dove grey waistcoat he had ordered from London in March without consultation and without
I must
ornament,
apologize for my candor
stood
earlier. It
Lord
was not my
Caspar
intent to
Winterbourne,
cause you unease.
5th Earl
Your
of
words were
Winterbourne,
clear and
in the
necessary.
place
I
his
hold
daughter
no
had named
unease.
for him,
I'm
in
relieved
her
to hear
March
it.
reply, behind. He had come down to Aldwick on the Monday with his small leather portmanteau and his own quiet apology written in his hand upon cream-laid paper folded in his coat pocket. He had not yet given it her. He had judged that she would tell him in her own time, when the hour was come. He stood behind his only son and his 4th daughter, his pale blue eyes a little watery, his silver-grey thinning hair carefully brushed, his fair, finely lined face composed, and he did not, this morning, look as a man who supposed his settled view to matter. He had had, as the Reverend Whittlesey would presently observe, 8 months to learn. Behind Lord Caspar stood Miss Prudence Fairbairn, brisk and small, in her best black bombazine with the small jet brooch, her warm, pale blue eyes steady upon the back of her former pupil's chestnut hair beneath the heirloom lace. Behind Miss Fairbairn stood Lady Hypatia Ashburn Craven, in her lavender silk, half-mourning, white lace fichu at her throat, a small jet brooch at the lace, her emerald green eyes carrying the quiet pleasure of an elder sister who had watched her brother choose well. And behind Lady Hypatia, in proper birth order, came the 3 elder Winterbourne sisters. Cecilia, in soft Wiltshire blue silk evening, for she had been married 3 weeks to the day at Salisbury, on Saturday the 5th of April, to her Sir Justin Harvey of Salisbury, and she carried the new composure of a young matron who had arranged her own affairs without ballroom and without aunt, then Daphne in pale pink silk, then Eudora in pale yellow silk, the gold-blonde heads a small Wiltshire cord behind the Sussex lace. The carriages took them up the Chestnut Avenue at 5 minutes past 10. The bells of St. Anselm's were ringing. At the altar stood the Reverend Caleb Whittlesey, in his white linen surplice over the black cassock, the white collar band clean and plain at his throat, the small silver crucifix on its black silk cord laid close against the white linen, his soft sandy grey hair newly cut, his clear, honest hazel eyes behind the small gold-rimmed spectacles steady upon the open book of common prayer he held in his long, thin hands. He was 53. He had been vicar of St. Anselm's, Aldwick, for 19 years. And he had not, in the whole of those 19 years, stood at this altar with a steadier composure than he stood with this morning. Lucian Henry Ashburn, 6th Duke of Aldwick, waited beside him. He wore the black, superfine evening tailcoat his London tailor had cut for him in November, the high white starched cravat tied close in the proper morning fashion, the white silk waistcoat with its very faint silver pinstripe, the black satin knee breeches, the white silk stockings, the buckled black evening shoes. Upon his right hand was the heavy silver Aldwick ducal signet, the sea falcon over the chalk pail catching the beeswax candle gold. Upon the smallest finger of his left hand was his late father's small
I must
mourning
apologize
ring,
for my candor
the thin
earlier.
gold
It was not
band
my
with its
intent to
single
cause you
jetstone
unease.
that
Your
he had
words were
taken
clear
from
and
the small
necessary.
leather
I
case
hold
in
no
his dressing
unease.
room at 6,
I'm relieved to hear
and
it.
worn for the first time in the 18 months since the funeral. At his lapel was a single sprig of white spring narcissus that Mr. Bartholomew had brought him at 8:30 on a small silver salver, and that Mr. Mercer's own hand had pinned for him in the long Aldwick stone hall before he came down. His thick, dark bronze-brown hair had been brushed close at the nape. The faint silver at his right temple caught the lancet light. The lock that had a habit of falling across his brow had not this morning fallen. His clear, deep, emerald green eyes were upon the chapel door. Persephone came in upon her brother's arm at the proper measured pace of a Wiltshire-bred bride. The cold, pale blue spring light from the south lancet windows caught the antique seed pearls at her hem. The warm beeswax candle gold from the altar caught the heirloom blonde lace. Her right step was a fractional half-second slower than her left at the threshold, and by the third pew it was scarcely visible, and by the chancel step it was not visible at all. She did not look to her left or to her right. She looked along the small, clear avenue of cold, pale blue light and warm beeswax gold to the man at the altar who had asked her 4 questions of her own, and the small village congregation, watching her come, kept their proper Sussex quiet. Mortimer gave her hand into the Reverend Whittlesey's hand and stepped back to his place at the chancel rail. Lord Caspar took his place in the front pew on the bride's side, his composed silver-grey head a little bent. The Reverend Whittlesey opened the Book of Common Prayer at the marriage service, and in the small 12th-century chapel of pale Sussex sandstone, above the South Downs in the cold pale blue spring light of Wednesday the 23rd of April, 1817, with the Aldwyck tenants and the parish villagers filling the chapel to the doors, he read the proper words. He came to the troth, and he asked the bride. Persephone's clear, soft contralto answered him through the chapel. "I will." He asked the groom. Asked the Lucian's deep, clear, quiet baritone answered him. "I will," and most freely. The plain gold Aldwyck heirloom ring that Lucian's mother had worn for 32 years and his grandmother for 40 before her, passed from Mortimer's gloved hand to Lucian's bare hand to the Reverend Whittlesey's open prayer book, and thence on to the 4th finger of Persephone's left hand, drawn close beneath the white silk glove she had set back at the wrist. The Reverend Whittlesey laid his thin hand for one breath upon their joined hands. He pronounced them man and wife. He closed the prayer book. In the small vestry behind the chancel, with Mortimer and Lady Hypatia as the 2 principal witnesses, and Mr. Mercer and Mr. Hollister behind them, Persephone took up the steel pen. She dipped it once. In her clear, even hand, she signed across the open page of the parish register. Persephone Eleanor Winterbourne Ashburn.
I must
Lucian
apologize
took
for my
the pen
candor
from her
earlier. It
ungloved
was not my
hand.
intent to
He
cause you
signed
unease.
below her name
Your
in
words
his
were
own
clear and
composed
necessary.
hand.
I hold no
Lucian
unease,
Henry Ashburn.
and I'm relieved to hear it.
Mortimer signed beneath. Lady Hypatia signed beneath Mortimer. The Reverend Whittlesey laid his blotter across the wet ink and pressed it once and turned the page. They came out of the vestry to the chancel steps. The Reverend Whittlesey lifted his clear, honest hazel eyes upon the small Sussex congregation and the small Wiltshire party, upon the gold-blonde sisters and the silver-grey father and the iron-grey housekeeper at the rear of the south aisle in her best black bombazine, upon the parish gardeners and the parish dairymen and the parish wives, upon the bride and the groom standing quiet before the altar, and he gave his 3-minute address. He spoke of the steady estate and of the proper office of marriage in the keeping of a steady estate. He spoke of the office of a parish, and of the long offices of the late 5th Duke, and of his late Duchess. He spoke of the office of a daughter who had, in her own right reason, given her own consent. And then he gave his grace. Father of all mercies, we thank thee for this bread, this wine, this fire, this roof, and these good friends. We thank thee particularly for the late 5th Duke of Aldwyck, 1745 to 1815, and the late Duchess his wife, 1759 to 1812, who would have been pleased to see this morning, for the late Lady Rowena Winterbourne, 1771 to 1809, the bride's mother, whose foundation upon her own name shall stand at Salisbury for as long as Wiltshire stands. For Lord Caspar Winterbourne, present at this altar, who has had 8 months to learn that his daughter's settled view of her father is to be the one that matters, and for the steady composure of one young woman of 23 who said yes in a Wiltshire library on the morning of the 4th of September 1816 to a man who had asked her 4 questions of her own. We commend the Duke and Duchess of Aldwyck and the years that lie before them to thy keeping. Amen. The amen of the Aldwych parish came back quiet and full from the oak pews. The Reverend Whittlesey did not name Lord Barnaby Winterbourne. He did not name Lady Guinevere Stafford. He had judged, in his 19 years of office, that a grace which named the worthy was sufficient unto the day, and that the unworthy were best left unnamed before the altar. The bells of St. Anselm's took up their half-hour above the South Downs. The bride and groom came down the chapel aisle at Lucian's slow, steady pace, her gloved hand at the crook of his arm, her right step composed and even now under the candle gold. The whole village had come out into the chapel yard, and as the carriage drew up at the lych gate and Lucian handed his duchess up the step, the parish wives and children threw white narcissus petals from their wicker baskets in a small, soft drift across the carriage door and the gravel beneath, and the carriage rolled back down the chestnut avenue to Aldwych Park beneath the cold, pale blue Sussex sky and the soft falling petals of April. The wedding breakfast was set at noon in the great hall. 50 couples to table, 5 removes.
I must apologize for my
village
candor
choir
earlier.
of 7
It was not my
sang
intent
the
to cause
proper
you
canticles
unease.
between the
Your words were
removes
clear and
in
necessary.
plain,
I hold
unaccompanied
no
voice.
unease.
The
I'm
white
relieved to
spring
hear it.
narcissus and pale green myrtle along the centre of the long oak table caught the warm beeswax candle gold. The cold, pale blue spring sun came in through the long west windows, and at the head of the table, the Duke of Aldwych sat in his proper place with his Duchess at his right. At the bride's left sat Miss Prudence Fairbairn in her best black bombazine, her warm, pale blue eyes carrying the quiet pleasure of a governess who had given her pupil this morning into a steadier keeping. At the groom's right sat the Reverend Whittlesey, his small silver crucifix laid against his black cassock, hazel eyes serene with the office well discharged. And at the bride's right hand, the place Persephone had named for him in her March reply, the place he had walked behind her in the procession to Earl, sat Lord Caspar Winterbourne. He sat composedly upright. He did not, this hour, drink claret beyond the single toast glass. He spoke quietly to his daughter when she turned to him, and to no one else. Once during the third remove, he laid down his fork and looked once along the great oak table at the gold-blonde heads of his 3 elder daughters, at his only son at the foot opposite the Duke, at Mrs. Hardcastle and Mr. Mercer at the lower end, and at his own 4th daughter at his right hand in the heirloom lace. He took up his fork again. He did not this hour speak. Mortimer kept the foot of the table with the easy composure of an heir who had stood witness to his sister's 4 questions. Lady Hypatia, between Lord Caspar and Sir Justin Harvey, kept the conversation moving. Cecilia and Sir Justin sat together at one side. Mr. Hollister halfway down the right with his small private smile. The local Sussex gentry took their proper places, Mrs. Hardcastle and Mr. Mercer at the lower end. The toasts were drunk, the choir sang, the cloth was drawn. The guests took their leave through the long Sussex twilight, the carriages going down the chestnut avenue, the cold, pale blue spring evening settling to the cool, clear quiet of an April night. It was quite late, quite past midnight, before the last carriage went. The last footmen drew the great hall doors to. The candles in the gallery had been put out. Mrs. Hardcastle had gone up to the housekeeper's room, with her chatelaine in her composed hand. The household was settled. Lucian had changed out of the black evening tailcoat into a plain dark green country coat with the proper white cravat, his hair brushed back, his late father's mourning ring on the smallest finger of his left hand. Persephone wore her cream cashmere shawl over the wedding silk, the white silk gloves still drawn to the elbow, the small coronet of narcissus and myrtle still in her chestnut hair, the heirloom blonde lace laid back against her shoulders. They came together through the small saloon, and out by the south door into the walled rose garden of Aldwych. The Sussex April night was cool but not cold. The soft southern moon stood clear over the South Downs and laid a steady silver across the gravel paths and the
I must
box
apologize
hedges
for my
and the
candor
trained
earlier. It
climbers
was not
along
my
the
intent
south
to
wall,
cause you unease.
where the first
Your words were
roses of the
clear and
year
necessary.
had
I
only
hold with
just
no
begun to
unease.
bud,
I'm relieved
the
to hear
small
it.
green knots tight against the warm sandstone. The garden was quiet, but for the distant call of a tawny owl in the Chestnut Avenue. Her right step was a fractional half-second slower than her left at the start of the walk. By the third turn under the south wall roses, in the silver of the moon, it was scarcely visible. He stopped beneath the south wall, where the buds were thickest. He took her ungloved right hand, for she had drawn the white silk, back at the wrist when they came out, into his own gloved left hand. He did not, this minute, kiss it. He held it. Persephone Eleanor Winterbourne, Ashburn, Duchess of Aldwych, my dear wife, I came to Winterbourne on the 26th of August, 1816, upon the proper formal expectation that I should consider an offer to one of 3 eldest daughters. I leave this April evening upon the proper formal certainty that I have, upon my own clear emerald green view, married the 4th. I am in your debt for the marriage I did not earn, and was given, all the same, by the steady composure of a young woman of 23, who said yes in a Wiltshire library on the morning of the 4th of September, after I had asked her 4 questions of her own. She lifted her clear sea-grey blue eyes to his clear, deep emerald green eyes in the soft southern moonlight. She did not, this minute, smile. Lucian, I shall not answer that this evening. I shall answer it every morning for a great many years. He held her ungloved hand a long minute in the soft southern moonlight beneath the budded roses of the south wall. He did not kiss it. The owl called once again from the Chestnut Avenue. The soft southern moon stood quiet over the South Downs, and after the long minute he laid her hand within the crook of his own arm, and they walked back together along the gravel between the box hedges, past the sundial, past the small fountain that had been set in 1782, to the lit windows of Aldwych Park. The last footman drew the great door behind them at 1:15 in the morning of the 24th of April, 1817. There are stories that begin with a kiss. There are stories that begin with a vow. There are stories that begin with what is not there. There are stories that begin with a knock, and stories that begin with a hired post-chaise. And there are, rarer, harder, more dignified, stories that begin with an open book of Tacitus's Annales upon a warm Wiltshire stone bench at 20 minutes past 8 on a cold blue August morning, when a 31-year-old duke, who had come down from London the night before to inspect 3 eldest daughters of an old Cambridge friend, stepped round the box hedge of an inner walk of a rose garden and found, instead of the Bourbon roses he had been promised, a 4th daughter. Her father had told him that evening, in the library after dinner, to marry any daughter but her. He had asked in answer whether she had ever been asked her own view on the matter. Her father had said, to his lasting shame, that she had not.
I must
So
apologize
the
for my
Duke
candor
asked her
earlier. It was not my
4
intent to cause you
times in 3
unease.
days.
Your words were clear
And
and
on the
necessary.
4th question,
I hold with no
on the
unease.
morning of the
I'm
4th of
relieved to hear it.
September 1816, in a Wiltshire library with her brother present as her chosen witness, she answered him for herself. And so, on a cold, pale blue Sussex morning of the 23rd of April in the year 1817, 8 months and a day after a Wiltshire rose garden had stood empty at 20 minutes past 8, before a 31-year-old duke had come round the box hedge to find an open Tacitus and the half-drawn beginning of a Bourbon rose, the bells of St. Anselm's Aldwych rang half an hour above the South Downs, and the daughter the Earl had asked the Duke not to marry became, by her own composed 23-year-old courage and the Duke's quiet steadiness, the Duchess he had at first sight chosen without hesitation.